We're taking a look here at the difficulty menu for Warhammer 40k Mechanicus. This is a really good difficulty menu, but, well, we don't need to talk too much about this. Mainly because I have no idea what I'm looking at, and maybe that's the same case for you. I'm going to talk about the cool and interesting moments in my playthrough of Warhammer 40k Mechanicus. Let's just say Mechanicus to save ourselves some breath. Lots of great difficulty options presented up front, but very much aimed at somebody who's already played the game before, I suspect, because all of this meant nothing to me. They were going to need some kind of tooltip system to explain the significance of all of these things for me to have any meaningful input on what they should be. What I did is go to the Global Achievements menu, because what I was wondering is this game going to be too easy if I play it on normal? I was self-conscious because I played StarCraft 2 on normal, and people were complaining that it was too easy, it went too well. So here I am, trying to find out, is this a game where nobody's finished it or something? Can I use that to guess how hard it is? I noticed it's a game where barely anyone got past the very, very beginning, which either means, well, one of two things, and they're both potentially bad. It's either extremely difficult, or it's not very good. To some extent, my guess in retrospect would be a bit of both, because the start of the game is surprisingly difficult, and the game is very upfront with the things that are bad about it, or to put it another way, your initial impression of the game is completely accurate, so if you don't like it, after the first 10 minutes, you won't like it, because it just goes on as it begins. And it's a similar thing to what I saw when I played Against the Storm. I've got a video on Against the Storm, which is actually one of my most disliked videos, probably because I was complaining about it the whole time, and it's a cult classic game that has 95% review scores on Steam, and I was there saying that, guys, this is a bad game. And I backed up my position by saying if you look at the achievement data, nobody played past the beginning. And my theory is something that I think applies to this game as well, where if the game is very sort of repetitive and cyclical, and you get a really good impression of what the game's going to be like right up front, so if you don't like the game, it's going to be really obvious to you that you don't like it immediately, then you just leave, you get out while the going is neutral, and you don't leave a bad review, helping the game get good reviews, even if when people buy the game they actually don't like it. So there's a curious little thing there. Essentially the difference between positive reviews per sale and just positive reviews as an absolute number, because Steam uses the absolute number. Games that people don't like can get quite high review scores in theory, or games that people are neutral about, I should say. They don't dislike, they won't register their neutrality, so the game will appear to be extremely popular. And this was a game that I think is like that. It's in the region of 90% on Steam, but as we just saw, 40% of people didn't finish the first mission. And I'll put it to you, it's because the first, say, half an hour of the game really does give you a great idea of what the game's going to be like, and it's probably fair to leave if you don't immediately like the game, because it's not really going to change as it goes on. That in itself could be taken as a criticism. Well, the point I'm actually trying to make is that this game is probably worse than it looks. I don't really want to say that, but I guess it's true, because that's what the numbers appear to say. Anyway, same deal with Against the Storm, where it was a game I liked, but felt obliged to say that it's bad, because it does appear to have some big problems, and a certain amount of the audience, that being a large amount, just don't play the game, so something went wrong along the way. Well, speaking of things going wrong along the way, what's happening here? We're doing some kind of text adventure challenge thing, and we'll be coming back to this because a lot of the game revolves around these little text adventure challenges. It's a game with a lot of story that doesn't necessarily impact the gameplay that much. Well, we'll see what I'm vaguely getting at later on. Right now, here's the main meat of the game. As you walk through the little sort of maze thing we saw earlier, which is the map on which the game takes place, you sometimes encounter fights. One thing to note is that we've got this skull, Redditor's here, telling us what to do, faster than going to Reddit to work out what to do, that's for sure. Earlier on, when you first meet Redditor's, he says something like, because you're in the Mechanicus and we're all about exploring new things and getting used to mechanics, you should work out how to play the game yourself, or something like that. And I thought they were going to do some sort of novel tutorial system where it deliberately didn't tell you anything in order to make it really hard to learn the game, and that was going to be part of the experience, was working out how the UI works as part of actual intended gameplay content. I was really interested by that idea because it would be a great salve to me often complaining that the Games I play don't have good enough tutorials to instantly understand them and just sort of have a really good first playthrough and then walk away. You often have to get outside advice to really enjoy the game to its full extent. And I thought this game was going to be about learning the game to some extent. I don't know. Essentially it lies, that's what I'm trying to say. When it says like you should learn things for yourself, the game's extremely detailed in its tutorials. It tells you everything, and it tells you what you need to know when you need to know it specifically. So it's better than most games in that regard. Like, it doesn't just have all of the information you need to play the game in the game. It tells you, like, at the very moment you need to know it, it tells you what to do effectively. And it was really good, so I found it quite easy to learn the game. However, what I'm getting at here does apply to the game to some extent. There is this heavy aspect of not knowing things deliberately and having to work with that. Because one thing that perhaps drove people away from the turn-based tactics point of view is that you get very little information on what the other side can do, the Necrons we're fighting, which to some extent limits the turn-based tactic aspect of it. Like, there aren't that many tactics available if you simply don't know what the enemy will or indeed can do. You can't see how far enemy units can move, you don't know how much damage they can do, you don't really know like detailed information like what they're going to do, such as in Into the Breach, where it tells you who they're going to target and things like that. So because, at least from a new player perspective, the enemy are acting essentially at random, like they're just doing random amounts of damage, they seem to move random distances each turn, it feels untactical. There is actually like a solid system behind it. It's just that you have to eventually get used to it over time. And not having that information makes the beginning quite difficult, along with not having very much gear to use, which we'll see more of later on. And I can totally see people just being like, man, this sucks, after playing the beginning and leaving. And indeed, we don't need to speculate, because that is what happened by the looks of things. And I myself was like that. When I started playing this game, I was like, I'm not having any fun. Like, these decisions seem arbitrary to me, there's no strategy. It's just sort of hard, I guess. Like, it seemed difficult to do anything. Like, this is the tutorial. You have to fight a boss, and I was getting obliterated by this boss. I'm just like, why is it like this? Like, why don't you give me the chance to, like, click on the enemy or something, or just get used to it, or just shoot some weak enemies to get the feel of things? I don't know. Basically, this is a stage which you play again later in the game. Like, this is an actual late game boss which you have to fight in the tutorial, and it's just really hard. Your goal is just to not die, so we're going to strategically hide in the corner. And I do remember I was having a miserable time, at least for the first few hours of playing the game, and I could totally see people walking away from this, so I sympathise with that. I didn't walk away for one simple reason. There was one mechanic about the game that I really, really liked, and I was like, I want to see whether this overcomes everything. Often on this channel, when I've played turn-based tactics games, I always make allusions to a different game that I've never shown on this channel, Valkyria Chronicles. This game has some Valkyria Chronicles mechanics in it, and that means it's good. Bang! Stamp of approval. In particular, it allows you to take many moves with each character per turn, so that's the thing that's different from the usual turn-based tactics design, where each thing does one thing per turn. In this game, because you can do as many things as you want, quote-unquote, per turn, with each character, the number of possible strategies, the number of possible things you can do with your turn is infinitely larger, and you can find some really interesting and some really powerful and exploitative feeling things by using systems like that. I'll try and show some examples as we go along, but just for this beginning of the commentary, I wanted my main point to be, my initial impression of the game was that it was bad. It appears that's affected other people as well. The game gets significantly better the more stuff you get to play with, because there are so many tactical options. Your lack of information about the enemy goes away eventually, because you kind of work out that certain enemies have a certain move range, it just doesn't tell you it for whatever reason, and I think it probably should just tell you, because it's not interesting to kind of guess or have to remember it or write it down or something. You could even make a whole mechanic out of that if you're feeling particularly frisky, where say like you just don't know the enemy's movement range, so it just doesn't tell you what it is, but once you've killed a certain number of them, it'll be like enemy movement range on this unit discovered, and next time you see it, it will show it on the map how far it can move. Something like that. This would fit with the theme of the game quite well as well, but I think if you're going to just do it in the simplest way possible, I'd say just tell you everything up front, because it's more interesting gameplay-wise, even if it doesn't make sense from a lore perspective. The point is, the things that I disliked about the game faded away the later into the game I went. It became easier to understand, more fun to play, and just in terms of gameplay balance, became significantly easier. And you could argue that there's a reverse balancing issue here, where like it starts really difficult, but then midway through the game it becomes so easy you might as well just stop playing it. And we'll see that this is actually going to be solved in my campaign to some extent, because I am playing with Ironman mode enabled, so no save scumming, and this is a game that allows and is perhaps even based around save scumming, and Permadeath enabled, so if you lose a unit, you lose it forever. That's a massive deal in this game, as we'll see, because there aren't many units. So losing one unit is a huge amount of your combat potential lost for the rest of the campaign. It's useful then that the unit I lost in the tutorial just now doesn't count, because the tutorial mission sort of happens on a separate timeline. The real game begins afterwards and your real army starts building after that. What's happening right now? The characters are talking about things. There are many characters in the game, and the other first impression, which I'll give now because it probably doesn't matter for the rest of the campaign, is that the writing is really good. I enjoyed all of the characters and the way they interact. It doesn't matter at all. If there was a mode up front, which was just like skip dialogue, the game would be much faster and would be virtually identical. Like the dialogue doesn't really pertain to what's going on very much. The game's very simple and basic, and the story around it kind of hypes it up for like what's happening to be of critical importance on some particular mission, but realistically all you're ever doing is just shooting at the enemies in very small turn-based tactics arenas. So no story at all is required for the game to function, it's just there for fun. But yes, it could even be a good idea to allow the players to just cut it out entirely, because it doesn't really need to be here, and it does slow the game down, and speed is something we'll be talking about as we go along, because this game makes all the classic turn-based tactics mistakes when it comes to speed. It's a genre problem that I've talked about before on this channel, where turn-based tactics just won't come into the future. I don't know, there's just certain conventions about how to make turn-based tactics UIs and how to implement animations and things that just never caught up with the future. We're still like in the PS2 era, or even perhaps that's too insulting to the PS2 era. I'm playing Tier Ring Saga on the PS2 on my Steam Deck at the moment, and it does a lot of the stuff that Mechanicus gets wrong better, like from 20 years ago. What exactly am I talking about here? Well, I'll try and show you as we go along, of course. It's time to get into the campaign for real and start this commentary. This game is very long and quite cyclical, so what I'll do is we'll take a decent look at the first couple of missions to see the concepts of the game, and then we can essentially say, and then it does that 50 times, and we'll take a much more brief look at the other times, I think. We'll look for cooler moments. So to start off, here's the mission menu, where you pick what mission you're going to do next. Each one gives a different reward, but at first I had no idea what would be useful, so I don't know, I was picking things basically randomly, and then a bit later, after getting a few items and a few different pieces of gear, you start to feel like, well, this piece of gear is what I'm probably going to use like the whole time, so I'll look for other missions that give better gear similar to that. No matter which one you pick, you're going to be sent off to do pretty much the same thing, and that's probably the overarching criticism, I suppose, of the game. Almost every mission is the same, but for the text it shows you at the beginning and during it, where the characters talk, and I think the writing to some extent carries the game, because the game itself shows and asks you to do nothing of the mission that your characters are supposedly doing. It all takes place in the background, so in between walking between rooms in this blue place, which is what this entire planet looks like as it turns out, you have these text adventure segments where it says that you're doing something, and you often have to make a decision that kind of feels like maybe it links in with what the people are talking about. It's only that, to me, it doesn't sufficiently link in. So for example, here's one of them. There's like 500 million of these in the game. Here's one. Mostly we'll be skipping over these in this commentary, so we'll just look at this one as an example. The main problem with these text adventure segments is that the result of your choice doesn't really link in enough with what the choice was or what the plot of the mission is, I don't think. It is to some extent possible to work out what the correct choice is, however, not to a far enough extent, I guess that's what I'm saying. Like, I felt like my decisions essentially came down to random choice in the end. Like, I just couldn't predict whether a particular choice would be bad. For example, that was a bad choice in that thing. I fixed it the medium amount you were allowed to fix it. That was the wrong answer. So there are lots of those where it'll ask you to make a decision, but the decision feels so arbitrary that I just didn't enjoy it at all. Similar to making very sort of meaningless decisions in turn-based combat, potentially, but this is something that doesn't really resolve as the game goes on. Although that said, much later, we'll see there is actually something you can do to make the text adventure segments more productive and more interesting to you. But for now, well, we're just doing stuff. Like here, this room has a miasma in it. Do we walk through it? Do we purge it? Or do we pray? I got the idea that perhaps because we're with a priest on this mission, that praying might be the correct answer, but this isn't some consistent rule like following your religion always leads to a good outcome or anything like that. So while I'm not going to show you many of these things in this video, my review of them overall was that there are too many negative outcomes that catch you by surprise. I think that's the key part of it. Like, it's okay for them to have negative outcomes, it's just that you so often don't expect them, or expect the positive outcome after like thinking through your choice and you get the negative one. I just felt like I had no handle on what's going on and ended up not caring very much. There's also the aspect to consider that it's something of a beginner's trap, because these are set choices. Like, I'm pretty sure the correct answer is the same every time. If you played the game a couple of times, or played each mission a couple of times, by using save scumming for example, you could find the correct answer and get some sort of reward by going through those rooms. Well, for us, we come away with two of our characters already lacking health from picking wrong options, and with a whole bunch of awakening built up. What is awakening? Something I kind of deliberately ignored at first and then later realized was the most important thing in the entire game. It's that number 3 in the top left. This is a global time limit. We are back at it again with a global time limit game, another link to Against the Storm. The other link being that what you're looking at right here, this battle map, is essentially the entire game. It's the same thing as Against the Storm, where the game itself never changes, it's just the environment that changes as it goes on. So we have different biomes of Tomb that all look roughly the same, but you're doing the same thing in each one. It looks like I'm actually just playing Against the Storm. If you don't know what that game is, don't worry, it doesn't matter at all, this comparison. So what are we actually doing? Well, we're going to continue ignoring the global time limit for now, while we do some turn-based tactics. Actually, the only thing I wanted to say about the global time limit is it adds on to that point I was making earlier, about people perhaps being turned off by the game. Global time limits is something I see people complain about, like whenever they're implemented, which is rarely because people don't really like them. This is a game that does have a pretty strict global time limit, and it looks like, after the game was released, a patch was released to significantly downplay the importance of the global time limit, so it used to be more of a problem. For me, we're going to ultimately not have too much issue with it, so we won't need to talk about it that much, but it looks like in the vanilla game design, it was going to be a much bigger deal. We'll talk about that later, I suppose. What's happening? We're getting shot to pieces by some Necrons right now. Your units are split between your troops and your tech priests. So the tech priests are essentially the main characters, and those are the ones that perma-die. Your troops are just chaff, which you can infinitely buy before missions, to have extra units in battle, which comes in handy because you can take 6 units at first and then more later, and you only have 2 characters, so you might as well bring some other guys to die for you and take damage. And as it turns out, this game is very heavily pushing you towards a strategy where you never take damage, or more so than that, a strategy where the enemy never attacks you, which is interesting and clever. This is because this game does not have chance to hit RNG, and that's another reason why someone like me might want to play this game, even though, like, on the face of it, I didn't like it. Because I hate turn-based tactics games with chance to hit RNG, which is roughly synonymous with the statement, I hate turn-based tactics games. That's a core element of the genre that I don't like. This is a game that doesn't include that, and it's a massive step up as far as I'm concerned. Being able to just do something means your planning potential, the strategy element of the game, is enhanced dramatically, because you can do multi-step plans, and this is a game that focuses on allowing you to do that. Here in this little clip, I'm looking for something in the menu, and I think I remember what this was. There's one issue with the game that came up throughout the entire playthrough, and I remember having trouble with this, well, throughout the entire thing. You can't see enemy health bars all the time. You can sometimes see them. For example, they're at the top of the screen on the turn order. What you can't do is mouse over the enemy and see how much health they have. And the health bar also shows their armor levels, and these are really important numbers to know for any potential decision. There they are, they appeared during the move select menu. What I wanted was that to be there all the time, because I'm trying to decide which of these two enemies I should go for with this servitor, and there are two big considerations to make. One is, will the attack from the servitor kill either of them, and so I should focus them down, and two is the armor mechanic. This attack here doesn't do that much damage, because the enemy has physical armor, and servitors do physical damage. There are two kinds of damage and two kinds of armor, physical and energy, which will come up from time to time. In my experience, even if an enemy had like loads of energy armor, I would just use energy attacks on them anyway and try to power through it, because it's kind of easier that way. But yes, generally you have a mix of those attacks, and you can be a bit more intelligent than I was. I tended to not be so intelligent because I focused on just getting the maximum number of attacks in. Even if it was like a 10 damage attack that only did 2 damage, I would still take it. Just because I'm always trying to push the enemy towards death at all times, rather than being optimal in spending my cognition points, which are the currency used to take actions. And that's what I was doing just there. I sent my skull to go pick up a cognition point from that pillar. What is a cognition point? I don't know, and I remember at first I just thought this is stupid. Like, I didn't enjoy the kind of lore implications of this mechanic. Like, I can't shoot my gun without like looking at this pillar. Like, what does that even mean in context, in universe? It's a really abstract mechanic where the tech priests need to gain knowledge before they're allowed to act, and you gain knowledge by reading things off the wall or by examining dead bodies, things like that. There's no real reason for it to be like this, it's just that it's a cool gameplay mechanic, and later on I just sort of forgot about like why I didn't like it. I think it's a really good gameplay mechanic, but I guess the big downside of it is that there's no reason whatsoever for it to actually be in the game. It's just there because it's a cool game thing. Well, fine, I accepted that later on. And because it's a mechanic that essentially allows you to move really far during your turn, because you can constantly move the same unit over and over again by spending cognition, potentially in such a way that you also gain cognition from your movements, such as, for example, moving up to a pillar during your move and picking up some more, which fuels you to keep going, you could say. You can do some really clever strategies with this, not shown here, but yes, in theory I could spend another cognition to get another cognition and have my character be in a new position without spending anything, something like that. In fact, there we go, I did it. Not for any good reason in that case, I don't think. For variety, let's cut to a different fight which took place in the next mission. The actual results of these fights I'm not going to go through in big detail because they don't really matter. And, well, they're all exactly the same, so we'll have plenty of chances. I'm just showing you this footage to talk about a topic over it, that topic being a follow-up to my praise for the game not having chance to hit RNG. I really liked that, but there is something that needs to be said about the damage RNG. The game still has random damage. It's not the biggest spread of all time, although on some weapons it is. Like, there are some weapons where it's like this will do between 1 and 10 damage. Other weapons, like the axe we just used there, it's like 3 to 5. So a decent-ish spread, a spread where essentially you don't know if an attack that could kill the enemy will. This is a lot like having a weapon that does a certain amount of damage, but has a certain chance to hit. That's also a case where an attack might kill the enemy, but you don't know if it will. And maybe you see what I'm getting at here. The removal of chance to hit RNG is then muddied, it's spoiled by the use of damage RNG, which isn't as bad because you're still going to do something. Like with chance to hit RNG, there's a chance that your turn will have no effect, which is really unfun and kind of pointless feeling. At least with damage RNG, your turn will do something. You just don't know exactly what it's going to do. And that does water down this whole like planning in advance thing. You can't be like, I'll do this move, this move, this move, because some of the moves might not do the thing you want them to do. Obviously this is a very deliberate game design choice because it's supposed to make you adapt to unpredictable circumstances. I mean, the game's theme would fit with that very well, and this also fits with the idea that you can't see the enemy's health a lot of the time. You don't know their movement range, their damage, things like that. You don't even know the range of your weapons, which is just insane to me. It does say it somewhere, it's like this gun has an 8-meter range, but like in combat, there's no marker showing you like, here's the radius around which you can shoot. It's only rescued by the fact that as you move, sometimes an icon will appear over an enemy to suggest that you can fire with a certain weapon from a certain position. So you can kind of work out the range of your weapon by playing with that mechanic, but it could also just straight up tell you, I don't know. It is essentially providing you what you need eventually, just in a sort of time-wasty, like many clicks, many mouse moves sort of way. Which is really the theme of what this game gets wrong, or what the turn-based tactics genre gets wrong, the thing I was talking about earlier. The big problem with this genre, which is exemplified perfectly in this game, aside from chance to hit RNG, it's, well, everything else. It's how I'm sitting here playing the game, but if you look closely and kind of try to put yourself in the player's shoes here, I'm not doing stuff a lot of the time because I'm waiting for something I asked to happen. So perhaps, for example, we'll look at this random turn. I have to pick where to move first, so that's one menu. The second menu is confirming where to move. This removes the UI for a while, you watch the move, there we picked up a thing, the UI comes back, we can start to pick our next action. So we pick the weapon we're going to use, go into a targeting menu, select the target, go through another animation to have it attack the target, then the UI comes back and we can pick our next action. So we see there a small example of something that could have been, in a true game design paradise, one click. I don't know how many clicks that was, like 8 clicks. I could, when my character is selected, click on a little thing over the enemy I wanted to attack that just says attack this enemy, and all of the stages there would just happen. You probably want to keep the player doing the movement manually, but that would also be optional if you were playing things fast and loose. This game is insultingly slow, that's the way I want to put it. It takes so long for many animations to play out. Well, I'm saying so long, and you're probably thinking, well, it takes like 1 second, what do you mean? The correct amount of time for it to take is 0 seconds, so for it to take 1 second is a problem. It's a case where you're in like a mental flow state that is disrupted by the game constantly because you have to wait for something to happen. And especially when it removes the UI, which it does very frequently, you're kind of thinking, I'll move here and then attack, but no, you start the move, the UI disappears, you wait for the move, the UI then comes back, and then you can say attack. It just doesn't need to be like that. It brings up the idea of what you might call input lag. So, for example, if I've selected a character and I'm targeting an enemy, what you're not doing is playing as the character targeting an enemy. You are playing as the commander of these characters, considering what to order them to do, and they will do it separate to your inputs. This is where the slowness of turn-based tactics comes from, the fact you're not controlling the characters, really. And it's where a good turn-based tactics game, like Valkyria Chronicles, gets things right, because basically in that game, when you're controlling a character, you are that character. All of your controls pertain to what they're doing. There's no UI where you're ordering them to do something. You are playing as them. And that's a mechanic that can be implemented into any turn-based tactics design. It just isn't. And it's weird because every other genre in the universe works like that. It's kind of like how turn-based tactics are hanging on to their strategy roots. I'm saying turn-based tactics. Turn-based tactics games are hanging on to their strategy roots by having it be like you are ordering them to do things. But it feels better for you to be doing the things as the characters, and is identical strategy-wise, so you might as well make the switch. Like there, when I ordered that servitor to make the attack, the click to make the attack shouldn't begin the process of attacking, it should end the process of attacking. That's essentially the difference, that's the input lag thing. When I click on an enemy to fire at them, that should be like pulling the trigger on the weapon. The damage happens immediately, because mechanically, all you are doing is ordering that damage to happen. So you might as well have the damage happen as you order it, or at least that might as well be an option. And that's where things like the 20-year-old PS2 game gets things a bit more right, where often there would be options to skip animations in games like this, or simplify animations, or just give you the result because you don't need to see the animation. It's the same thing for a 30-hour game over and over again. I don't actually need to see the characters move. I don't need them to see them like raise their weapon, turn, and then pull the thing, and then wait for the projectile to hit. And it's like, all I wanted was the 2 damage. Just say, the second I give an order that does 2 damage, it pops up, says 2 damage, and moves right on to the next order you have to give. The UI is never removed. You're never out of control of the game. There is no quote-unquote input lag as you wait for the thing that is already inevitably going to happen to actually happen. Simply because it's going to happen so many times, there's no need to emphasize the animation or the real-world thing that's happening there. I think, anyway, and I think that's a big weakness with basically all turn-based tactics games, but it's a particularly big weakness in Mechanicus because nothing is done to salve the damage that does to the player's interaction with the game. There's no speed-up mechanics, there's no skipping, there's no mercy. Like, there are probably more layers of having to select your orders and input them than there needs to be. For example, the classic case of if you have a weapon that can only hit one target, and you click the weapon to use it, you still have to click on the one target. Like, that's an example where a bit more intelligent programming could skip out some of the process. I don't know if considerations like this are part of the reason that maybe the game wasn't keeping players very well. I have seen people actually specifically complaining about this game in that regard, but I also see people complaining about all turn-based tactics games in this regard, and I am with them on this. It's like one thing that really annoys me. These are games that would be so much better with a little bit more player consideration, and there seems to be a really slow movement in the turn-based tactics game design world to gradually make turn-based tactics games play more like normal games, where the thing that you want to happen just happens right away. Have more consideration of the player's time, especially because turn-based tactics is a very slow and janky feeling genre, because turn-based time mechanics already are a janky concept. I don't know. Just another day, another rant, but I was mad about that in this game in particular. There is one way to solve this problem in the game. I say solve, to make it less bad, which is essentially to do some of the developers' work for them, and we'll see that later on once I discovered it. But for now, we're just going to have to be suffering from very slow combat, which does compound with the fact that every single stage in the entire game is almost exactly the same. Like, if you were to skip to the end of this video, you'll probably see something that looks exactly like what I'm showing you here. We've essentially seen the entire game already at this stage in the commentary. We just have to do this 50 times. And that is a gameplay challenge because there's permadeath and there's me not knowing what the game's like. It's all going to be problematic to us. There's a lot to think about, and it is a good turn-based tactics game in terms of the strategy. There's definitely a good game hidden here. It's just behind all of these guys slowly walking around and slowly shooting you, as we saw there. They just take their time to do everything, and it just doesn't need to be like that. And I feel almost stupid complaining about it because it probably looks so innocent. It's like, well, yes, you're waiting 1 second. Can you just stop complaining about it? I actually can't, because I'm trying to play the game, and like any frame where I don't have control of the game I'm playing, the game has to justify taking that control away from me, because I'm the player. Like, I should be doing something. I want to be having thoughts and having actions, you know? Like, I'm trying to do an activity here. Like, even if you were walking down the street and every 5 seconds, say, you had to stop for 1 second, that would be pretty annoying, to just stop, wait for a second, and then keep walking, because you kind of were doing something, like you don't want to stop. So I think it's fair to cut out all the stuff that doesn't actually have any impact on the game, it's just delays for animations. And what frustrates me is that clearly people making these games do not agree, and Mechanicus is an example of a game that's worse than usual, so it kind of represents the trend going in the wrong direction, which puts me off a decent amount. Well, I still played it despite all of these additional complaints I'm still giving you, but it is the case, full disclosure, I would not have played this game if I wasn't making a YouTube video about it. Like, at first, the only thing keeping me going was like, oh, I can just do the classic turn-based tactics rant. Like in any potential turn-based tactics game, I'll just make it for this one. That'll be something to talk about. That's some content. It was only when I got further, sort of getting material for that I thought, I guess this is a good game. I just would never have thought to play it after the first couple of sessions. I was like, I'm completely done with it at first. And as I said, that appears to be a pretty popular opinion of the game as well, and that's probably a big problem, and maybe some of the things I've touched upon are the reason behind that. It's another day, and I think I have some more rants to make about Mechanicus, so we'd better strap in. Here's something actually happening though. We're making a decision, and I'm just showing this as an example of the difficulty, I guess, of these decisions, where I don't clearly know the link between what I'm choosing and what's going to happen. So when you see the outcome, it just kind of feels random. There is actually a link, I believe. It's just hard to predict, for me at least. So I didn't enjoy those very much, especially when the result was bad, which is quite a lot of the time. Moving on, we see a new room here with a glyph in it, and the glyph system was a little surprising at first because it asks you to choose between two shapes, and similar to the text adventure thing, it's like, well, what exactly are we doing here? Like, why am I choosing? What does this mean? I picked the right option there, and got 47 currency units as a result. What I gradually worked out is that the glyphs have a set meaning. Like, when you first see this, perhaps the developers weren't really taking this into account. One presumes there is some sort of contextual meaning to the glyphs, and that there was something like I could have seen that would mean that when I saw this shape, it's like, that's the shape that a unit had on it or something, and like it would have a meaning that pertains to this mission or this situation. It's simpler than I thought it was, and that's just the source of the confusion for me. What it essentially is each glyph gives you a set thing throughout the entire game. So like every time you see a certain glyph, if you pick it, you get a set thing. And there is, on Steam, a list of what they all do. It's a memory game. It's just a trial and error memory game, as it turns out, which is absolutely rubbish. We don't need that at all. It's something where it might make your second playthrough of the game more fun or something like that, because you know what all of the options are, or I guess it would make it easier, that's the more important thing. But I don't enjoy mechanics like that, where it's just trial and error and then remember the answer, especially because I would like to have that happen in the game. So, well, the same thing I was talking about earlier with like working out enemies' attack ranges. Once you in real life know it, your characters in the game need to also know it. So if you see a glyph and you do know what it does, the text saying what it does would appear on the screen. That's essentially what I'm asking for. Only a relatively minor change. You could even, though, remove the entire thing, or have the glyph be a mini-game or something. Like, I don't know, just like the memory game aspect wasn't very interesting to me. I think what put me off, especially in the beginning, was that you're under a lot of pressure because the game's relatively difficult at first. And what you don't need is random debuffs and like random choices to be put in front of you. So I feel like the developers, like who already know the correct path through these decision trees, don't really have an appreciation of how much pressure it adds to somebody who's just sort of seeing them as pure random decisions and just being randomly punished, quote unquote, for quote unquote no reason. So yes, there is a reason behind it, but from the player's perspective, there won't be. So it feels like you're struggling with the game, it asks you to pick a card, any card, you say, okay, that one, and they say that was the wrong choice, and slap you across the face. It's like, okay, why is this even part of the game? Like, that's my reaction to it. Like, why is that even an option for just a bad thing to happen for no reason? Anyway, I actually repeated the clip there because I wanted to point at the screen and say, look, it costs money to restore your health after missions. That was unexpected. I guess it's along a similar line of, like, you're under so much pressure, and it's like, oh, and you have to pay to get your health back, by the way, and it's like, oh, damn, like, it's too many things to have at first. I don't know, maybe on, like, the beginner difficulty or the first difficulty level, you don't have to pay to get your health back or something like that. Feels like a really advanced mechanic to have, like, right up front. I kind of like it, though. Like, the idea is that you're not supposed to get hit in combat, so the game heavily punishes you for getting hit by making you pay to get your health back, and the money is in short supply. The money is also what you use to level up your characters, and you can perhaps immediately smell the positive feedback loop and the possible problems it could cause there. The worse you do in combat, the slower your characters level up. Taking damage effectively reduces your experience bar in an abstract sort of way. So you need to not take damage, and the more you don't take damage, the easier it will be to not take damage. So it's the classic, if you're good at the game actually becomes easier. It's not just your skill making it easier, the game becomes easier for you. So that's handy, isn't it? And it's the sort of thing where it's really beginner unfriendly. I really like it in retrospect. I think it's a nice touch, but only because I got good enough that it wasn't a problem for me. If I'd been having problems with this, I would be screaming and ranting about it a lot more. Luckily, we're going to not do that. I'm going to just be subjective about it. I didn't mind it so much. I enjoyed the idea that you should really try to not take damage. Although there is something about it I didn't like, which I'll talk about in a second actually, because I've already lined up more rants. What am I doing here? We're equipping some gear on our priests. This is where the game's really interesting to me. You have so much gear, you ultimately unlock loads of different item combinations. So the build on each character is roughly based around what kinds of items they have, what kinds of weapons they have, and there are all kinds of synergies and such defined as you might expect. One thing you also might expect was for it to tell you the range on the weapons. I think I already touched upon that in one of my previous days' rants in this video. It doesn't tell you the range on weapons. It shows you it when you're trying to fire them in combat, which is a bit too late. Like when you're deciding what to take into combat, knowing the range of different weapons would also be handy. Eventually, we'll have our priests decked out with all sorts of stuff, and you level them up down certain archetype trees or class trees, where they become good at certain things. So we've got two characters. I'm making one into a healer and the other into a melee guy, so we'll focus on skills related to that here in these trees right here. Although you can mix and match any of them, although they have to be in order, so you can start going down any class tree essentially. And if you get loads of money, you could just put loads of level ups onto one character if you like. Probably a bad idea. In terms of level up choices, I had a certain idea of which skills would actually be useful and which ones were there as a kind of trap and you should just avoid taking them. I ended up being wrong about this, and I changed my build later in the game to something much more powerful than what I went for at first. Maybe we'll talk about that later. Here, it's time to make a decision. Do I pick up some bugs? Do I pick up fewer bugs? Or do I not pick up the bugs? And again, it's well, I don't know. What's going to be the bad thing? I picked the one where I picked up many bugs, and you could imagine that being the bad thing, where the awakening bar would go up because the enemy saw you running about picking up bugs or something. No, that was the good thing. We gained some cognition because we studied the bugs. We also found some cash. I don't know, these bugs were rich, that's pretty handy. A pleasant surprise. But I would be mad if it had been an unpleasant surprise, and even with the pleasant surprise, I don't really see the connection, or whether I should have expected that to be the outcome. With the glyph thing here, we actually get lucky. The last 3 glyphs we've seen all had one of the same options. There are 15 or something total glyphs, and I kept getting the same one, allowing me to get the good outcome of the pick a random outcome thing the game is effectively throwing at me. I guess it's not so random anymore because I know that one of the outcomes is good. That's handy, isn't it? Now, I realized I didn't really explain the global time limit that I touched upon earlier, so for people who don't know what I'm talking about with that, it's this thing in the top left where a number is counting up in each mission, and at the end of the mission, that number is added to the global limit, where you have to keep it below 100%. Well, you don't have to, the game ends if it reaches 100%, and you have to do the final boss, I think. The bar fills up by 2 every time you move in the tomb map, and in the battle stages it goes up by 1 every round or every complete turn. So it is a time limit de facto. It's also a movement range limit or something. You want to move as few times as possible when navigating the tombs, and in combat you ideally want the combat to end before the end of the first turn. And it is possible to do that sometimes, depending on what your setup is. There's also one more consideration in that in combat you sometimes have these little computers that I didn't realize were of any significance, but after a while realized if you kill them it reduces the awakening bar. That's perhaps something that the very good tutorial system never mentions, but is actually very important, and later on I found my strategies and my tactics revolved entirely around finding ways to take out the computers, because I started focusing entirely on avoiding awakening, because essentially your awakening cost per mission determines how many missions you're going to be allowed to do in the game. So there are more missions that will be given to you than you can do if you spend, say, 3 awakening points each time. I'm saying spend, if you accumulate 3 awakening points each time. And I believe what the situation was on release was every time you did a mission, no matter what the awakening bar in the mission actually said, it would add 3 to your global awakening. So that was a strictly enforced global time limit. And at some point, people complained enough, I guess, that they switched it to being that the awakening goes up by how much you actually accumulated in the stage. And that means it can go up by 0, which can allow you to effectively break the global time limit system and break the game as a result, which is what we're going to be trying to do. It's like this because it's more fun, I guess. I don't know if the game was rebalanced to account for giving players the ability to do this. In many cases, I would even argue that in most of the game, it's actually possible to avoid having the time limit go up at all in missions if you have a really overpowered setup, and, well, I'm saying this because I ended up getting one, as we'll see later. But the only thing about the global time limit is to add on to the point I think I already made, which is that it's kind of scary. It's a source of pressure, a source of stress, where every mistake you make is being punished more than just the actual immediate result of the mistake, because if the mistake makes the stage take a little bit longer, then the game gets harder as a result. And it's kind of okay for it to be like this. I'm complaining about it, but my angle on this is really that of somebody who wanted to just play through the game immediately, and understand it immediately, which is my usual style on this channel. It's kind of frustrating to be looking at the game and be learning so much about it, and be always thinking, I should start the game again. That's something that was constantly coming up, and I'm being punished to some extent by playing on Ironman mode, because even in individual stages, I would learn new tactics on the fly and realize things about the game, and then be like, I would play this particular stage better if I could just reload the save. And obviously that's true of any game, but it matters in this game because it's a strongly positive feedback looped game where, not losing health in the early game makes the entire rest of the game easier because you get your skills earlier and you do better in missions earlier and you complete missions faster and you have less awakening, you can do more missions, you have more equipment. There are so many different systems that make the game easier based on how well you played at first. That for me to come in, play the game badly at first and be constantly noticing that I am, just didn't feel very fun. This is a very specific complaint. I don't know if we can classify this as a problem with the game. It's a problem with the concept of a positive feedback loop game for somebody who doesn't want to restart the game because they're busy. I just wanted to play the game one time. What I'm basically saying is I should have played on a really easy difficulty because I just wanted to look at the game. But then I'm also trying to critique it, and I want the most default experience, but then I just want that default experience to be easy enough that because I'm always playing the game at the end of the day, I'm always tired, I always don't really want to have to think about it that much. I just want it to go well so I can get footage for my content. I'm playing this in a really game journalist sort of way, where things like the game being short is more of a positive, because my main goal is just to get out of here and not have to play it anymore, things like that. An interesting topic, I always think about that when professional game reviewers review a game. They do have slightly different interests to the regular players. We're about to make some sort of Marxist style rant right here about the proletariat of gamers and the bourgeoisie of gaming journalists who have different material interests in game design. This applies to me as well. So I'm saying to you, you should probably ignore these really specific problems that I have with the game. But I think some of them might be real. And things like concerns regarding casualness actually maybe are more of a proletariat gamer style thing to think about, because your average gamer might actually be playing this after work and not really want to have to think about how much pressure the game is putting them under. So having things like paying for restoring your health, having a global time limit, you can see why these would put off somebody who's just kind of playing this. Maybe there's somebody also in the room with them, maybe there are children around, maybe they're trying to do something else at the same time as playing, having a really real life style experience with the game. For them to be worrying about things might be trouble, and this is kind of what I felt when I was playing. It's a game that makes you worry about a lot of things, and as a result, it's kind of only fun when everything goes really well. It's more fun because of that, like this is sort of Dark Souls style angle where because the game's kind of annoying and because you'll immediately have trouble with it, when you don't have trouble with it, it then feels better as a result because it feels like a mountain was put in front of you and then you climbed it. But I don't know how it balances out. Like, I don't know if you ultimately had more fun with it being like that, or would it have been more fun if you just kind of learned how to do it yourself along the way and didn't have to experience all of the failure and any sort of associated negative emotions that come with that failure. I'm mad because Mechanicus made me stressed when I played it. I think that's what I'm saying. And later on, like looking back on it, when I was like completely unstressed, I was like, ha, this game's too easy, which is like, you know, you can get elitist about these things. I'm like that with Dark Souls. I'm like, Dark Souls is so easy, guys. There are just really specific reasons why people don't think it's easy. Mechanicus is one of those games as well, where once you know how to play it, it's actually extremely easy and becomes one of the easier turn-based tactics games. It just doesn't seem like that, and it feels like the developers added all of these things that put you under pressure in response to the game being secretly easy, but because the players don't know that it's secretly easy when they play it, your first impression is to just get hit with all of the anti-good player mechanics, all of the pressure, all of the difficult stuff, and you probably feel like, damn, this isn't going to work, or at least that's how I felt. Like, I could sense the whole time that when I took one damage, it's like that's one damage that's going to be a problem for the whole campaign, that sort of thing. It isn't really like that, but it could be, in theory. Like, to the new player, that's a plausible thing for them to believe. At least I'm claiming that, because I believed it at the very least. And this isn't necessarily a criticism again, because it's a criticism of the game when played from the perspective of somebody who's never going to play it again, that sort of situation. Where having stuff to overcome by experience that is gained through failure specifically, that kind of gaining experience, isn't necessarily very useful, because I'm not going to get to put those lessons from the failure into practice. Like, if I got into a soft failure state in the game, I would just quit. I wouldn't play it again, because it's not engaging enough. Learning by failure isn't that fun to somebody who's very eager to play a different video game at the same time. This is a very meta consideration, like game design in a world where other games exist. Your game design has to actually fit like a puzzle piece into that of all the other games that each user has installed and might plausibly switch to playing at any given time. A very difficult thing to take into account. Not that I'm really blaming the developers for not making the perfect game that caused me to uninstall and delete all other games in the universe, or am I? What am I actually talking about here? I'm not quite sure. One related point to mention though, which doesn't really come up at a specific time in this commentary, so I'll just continue ranting over this generic footage, is that because losing health costs money, you need to focus in your combat missions on healing yourself, which gives you this slightly interesting decision-making system where you don't necessarily want to defeat the enemy, because if you kill the enemy during your turn, that means you might have less time to heal and end the mission with more health, so that you don't lose money. In terms of like lore and immersion, this is really bad. That's probably where the big problem with that sort of crossover comes. Like, we're in a world where the Mechanicus units can heal for free, but only in fights for whatever reason. So in fights, you want to focus on having as much health as possible, because afterwards, for some reason, you have to start paying to get your health back. Which is only annoying because it feels like the coolest way to go through a stage is like the fastest way, but it actually isn't like that. Sometimes you want to be almost exploity and be like, well, I'm not going to kill the enemy, because if I let this fight go on another turn, I can spend a turn healing before I take off the final 1 HP on the final enemy, and that will save me some money. And maybe that's worth trading the extra bit of awakening you might get for waiting to do that. It's an interesting decision potentially, but to me it just was like an annoying decision. It was like a thing in the back of my mind, like, don't kill the enemy, don't kill them, like, what are you doing? You're trying to do the objective? You should, like, wait to do the objective so that you can heal up and not have to spend money once you get back to the ship, that sort of thing. This didn't really come up that much in the campaign, only because it ended up getting so easy that I was basically always at full health for the entire game, and I didn't have to make this consideration. But that consideration is there in theory, and I didn't really enjoy it being there. That's the only thing I wanted to say about that. Let's try and move on, if that is at all possible. I'll probably have another rant for you tomorrow. Let's see what it is. Hello, it's now tomorrow, and I think the situation might be coming under control. The only thing I wanted to mention, that I probably didn't mention before, I don't remember, is that the awakening bar does also do something in battle, which presumably was all it was supposed to do in this original vision of the game, where you couldn't use it to change the global time limit. It gives the enemy various buffs, which are represented by the icons in the top left. Mainly, it's more enemies spawn, and their respawn timer goes down. Because they are the Necrons, if you know Warhammer lore, they are immortal or something. So when you kill enemies in battle, they actually come back if you don't end the battle very quickly. Although if you kill them the second time, they go away forever. Although luckily enough, this essentially didn't happen to me for the extreme majority of the campaign, so I didn't realize how bad it was, or how good it was, I should say. I didn't realize that if you killed them again, it wouldn't be a problem, so you never have to kill them more than twice, but once is enough. So early on, I spent a lot of effort trying to double tap the enemies, because if you hit them while they're on the ground, they teleport away and then they won't respawn during the battle. However, it's really more important to actually just end the battle and expend your turn attacking alive enemies so the battle ends, because everyone who is respawning at the end of the battle is considered to be killed and gets added to your kill list. Therefore, you shouldn't really be wasting actions just trying to stop somebody respawn, unless you're absolutely sure you can't finish the battle before they respawn. In this case, because I suck and it's the early game and we're playing things quite slowly, it probably is actually worth attacking the downed enemies again and wasting an attack on that. Well, who knows. Later on, I stopped doing it entirely for all intents and purposes because you stop needing to do it. So there's another mission victory. You might be wondering, like, what are these missions? Nothing is the answer, like, that's the point I want to get across. All of these missions are just kind of the same thing in practice. In context, they have some different purpose to your mission on the planet, but this doesn't matter at all, and that's the only point to make. After missions, you sometimes unlock these spells, the canticles. I only ever used a couple of these, and it's that one that just popped up and that one were ones I used fairly often. I essentially settled into a familiar canticle pattern where I always brought 1 healing spell and 2 cognition gaining spells, which basically just lets you do anything. Very broad spells that can be used in any mission. What I was doing for my mission choices is looking for the ones that had non-equipment rewards. We'll see more of that later, and we've actually just got a non-equipment reward. We've got the rarest and most important one, a new tech priest. It's incredibly uncommon to find a mission that gives you a tech priest, and these are the characters that can permanently die, and as you can see we only have 3. So were one to die, that would be a bit of a problem, and of course we'll be talking about that as we go on. So now we have 3, and my third guy is going to be a ranged character, with the first one being a healer and the second one being a melee guy. Here's an actual tactic to point out. Some enemies and some allies take up 4 spaces on the board, so to speak. That means there's certain parts of the map they can't go into, because sometimes the maps have 1 tile wide pathways. And here we can take advantage of this, sort of, by going to the left of this wall so that the big thing over towards the right side of the wall won't be able to get into this gap. I don't know, that doesn't really help us because it can just sit at the end of the gap and shoot into it. But this probably felt like I was being very clever in some way. You saw me there using Cognition movement, so this is the Valkyria Chronicle style mechanic where I've taken melee mixed turn twice, and it would have been in my advantage to take it a third time, and I did have the option to do so, because I could have closed in with the Necron that's standing over there and put him into melee. The game has a very tabletop Warhammer-y style rule where if you're standing near an enemy, you're considered to be in melee with it, and it can't shoot at you. Ranged weapons only work for things that are outside of a melee. In practice, what this means is the AI will just try to walk out of the melee and will take a melee attack. You get a free melee attack on anything that's leaving melee. I'm not sure if that's a Warhammer tabletop rule, but it's a rule in this game. And it comes in very useful, we'll probably see it. There's me popping a skill that reduces the cognition cost of the next attack by 2, and a lot of attacks in the game cost 2 cognition to use. And early on, when you only have a maximum of 4 cognition to spend, that's a big deal. It essentially amounts to getting an extra attack per turn, which can make a big difference. I liked that skill so much, I ended up giving it to every character, and you'll see the build I go for in this campaign pretty much has every character end up being the same, until a bit later when I realised there's like a better way of doing it, and then switched to having everybody have that other same build. Maybe we'll see what I mean later. Here's what I meant about getting things into melee, that's going to be useful for us. This giant thing with a giant gun can't shoot if I'm standing next to it. Although in practice, as I said, it can hover away and then shoot, but it will take damage on the way out. So you're getting a free attack, and the attack doesn't cost cognition either, so it's actually better than a normal attack to attack the enemy through this method. You can see me considering not doing it here. I'm considering walking away and putting this thing out of melee, which is my choice to do. There is actually a reason not to do it, which is that being in close quarters with the enemy conflicts with another main mechanic of the game, area of effect attacks. A lot of attacks have area of effect, and right here you can see if I want to finish off this Necron, I have to shoot one of my own characters at the same time because of the area of effect. I say have to, I could have moved somewhere else such that it doesn't. In that case, it doesn't matter because our armor absorbed the damage. And we also have another area of effect attack that's mainly a cone behind the enemy. So that's okay for this situation. But essentially a lot of the tactics that I won't really be talking about will be based around positioning and trying to make it such that ranged attacks won't hit me so much and will hit the enemy more. There's a lot of that in the game, and yes, I probably can't really talk about it because there's so much of it. It's a sort of moment-to-moment consideration, or a move-to-move consideration really, because this is a turn-based tactics game without moment-to-moment considerations. Here's something though that I did want to rant a little bit about. As this stage goes on, some more enemies spawn. On many stages, the Necron tombs are just sort of around the place, and they will occasionally open and put more enemies out, and I'm guessing it's something to do with your awakening bar going up. We have here another positive feedback loop, of course, so the positive feedback ranter is back in town. It's punishing you for failure by just making you fail more, because the reason there are more enemies is because I was taking too long to do the stage. Now, the stage will take longer because it's added more enemies. You know, it's like, here's your speeding ticket for speeding. The ticket says on it, you have just received 2 speeding tickets. It's like, what? But I just failed, and the punishment for failure is that I'm failing even harder? I would love to see essentially another option here, where if the time is running on and the game wants to deploy more troops against you, you can do something, say like sacrifice health or pay to keep the enemy out or lose your cognition or something, because the choice is always nice in a tactics game. And I just don't like this idea that the game gets harder and harder, like the worse you are at it. The classic thing, it's just here to have something to avoid, and it's something that I did avoid for most of the campaign, but early on, again adding to those rants from the other day, it was adding pressure in the one part of the game when I didn't want it to add pressure, and then later in the game it has no effect for all intents and purposes, and that's where it needs to have an effect. So something's going wrong there, just some reverse balancing. It's probably positive feedback loopy in some way. There's some sort of problem with how loopy it's become. Looks like we can avoid here being at 4 awakening by just about ticking things down to 3 by killing that computer, so I did work it out at some point. And there's an example of this melee attack, the opportunity attack as the game calls it, where that Necron was trying to walk away from melee and just got hit on the way out and died. So yes, even if you finish the mission with almost 4 awakening, it counts as the lower number, it rounds down. So we only get 3 added to our global time limit, and we've just unlocked another of those coveted rewards, something that increases the cognition bar. I think it's that, the Tech Priest unlock, and a thing that unlocks how many troops you can take into battle that I was generally focusing on. In fact, there is one right there, and also the troop unlocks, which was there as well. That actually matters less than I thought, because you have to pay to bring extra units into battle, and then in battle you pay cognition to deploy them. So in practice, having loads of characters available for a mission won't necessarily be helpful, because you have to give up on doing other things to deploy your characters. And it might not be worth it, essentially, because your tech priests are so powerful. Maybe using 2 cognition on making them do something is better than spending 2 cognition to deploy an extra unit that might just die or won't be as useful, basically. It's hard to judge. The earlier in the fight you get the troops down, the better, essentially. We'll see more troop shenanigans later. Essentially, early on, I didn't use them very much. Later, I used them constantly because I realized they're really useful for various things. The main use they have, sort of obviously and early on, is that it's fine if they die. Permadeath doesn't apply to them. You have infinite troops. So that's pretty useful. You can just have them be in front of your characters during the enemy's turn, and they will probably take all the damage. Here I am, in fact, sending my soldiers forward to do my dirty work. I said you have infinite soldiers. That's not quite true, actually, because you do have to pay to use them, so you can't really sacrifice them freely. Although, one thing that confused me for a while is that you don't necessarily pay very much to use them, and I think I was avoiding them too much as a result. Because while you pay an upfront cost to bring soldiers, they actually have a similar mechanic to the tech priests, where you actually pay to heal them rather than use them. It's just presented in a different way, so it doesn't look like that. And that's probably an issue. They might as well have it be the same between troops and tech priests. So here, for example, our tech priests lost health, and it says you lose Blackstone as a result. For the troops that lost health, it looks like you gained Blackstone by this logic. Like under the soldier with the sword there, it says we've gained 7 currency units because they lost a bit of health. The way it works is, if they had full health, you would get the full amount of the amount you paid them up front back, although it's not actually the full amount. I think it's like 80%. There is some amount you can get back, and you get the full amount of that amount you can get back if they are undamaged. Well, I'm complicating things, but I'm also accusing the game there of complicating things, and I didn't understand how it actually works for a decent amount of time, probably just because of how it's presented in the UI. Now we've unlocked a new sector here. This turns out to be very important, and it brings up the question of what are we even doing in this game? And that's a pretty good question, because what the objective of the game isn't discussed in the game. It's very interesting in that regard. You kind of eventually infer that your goal is to kill 5 bosses and then the final boss. However, the characters don't know that. I don't know. I'm not sure what the characters think we're supposed to be doing. To the characters, each individual mission is just its own thing, and they have their own motivation for doing it. We never discuss what the overall goal of doing missions on this planet is. And in the meta sense, in the gameplay sense, it will turn out to be to fight the various bosses, and here are some missions to fight the bosses. We've unlocked them already. You essentially unlock bosses by doing a certain number of missions in each sector, I think anyway. I don't even know still if that's how it works. And by killing the bosses, you can unlock a final boss, and killing that solves the game in some way. But your characters aren't necessarily aware of that, and I wasn't aware of that as a player either, and that's the real point to make. So when I saw those boss stages, I was like, well, I just won't do them, because I figured they were optional, difficult stages for people who felt really unchallenged and wanted to do something different, because they don't offer any obvious reward that's different to normal missions. So I ignored them for a very long time until I kind of worked out what I'm supposed to be doing. Maybe we'll see that happen later on. I wanted to say something about the stage design a little bit anyway, in that all of the stages are kind of the same, and I guess you'll get that idea as we move through. Another link to Against the Storm, where mechanically everything is the same, but they visually will sometimes look different, and it feels like the differences between stages just aren't enough. Like, there's no point dividing the world into sectors if you're going to make them all essentially the same. Might as well have had more stuff, like maybe there's lava hazards or something. Well, here is something. I wanted to point this out. Sometimes there is a moving platform. I've just put this guy on the moving platform, ready to get shot as well. I believe the AI always fires at whoever's closest to them, so I could have taken that into account, although I also don't think I knew that yet, based on something that happens in a second. Anyway, the point is, there's a moving platform. That's something that's interesting about this random stage we're in right now. Stuff like that is incredibly rare. Most of the stages don't have any gimmicks, and because the game is very long and repetitive, that's a problem. The same Against the Storm criticism. Again, I'm going to keep bringing up this game. I really hope you know what I'm talking about. The good news is, it doesn't matter. Now here's a bit of strategy going on. Do I want to use my energy weapon against this enemy that doesn't have any energy armor? Or do I fire it against the 2 unknown enemies in the distance? We get the advantage of hitting 2 enemies at the same time, but we don't know how useful it is. I think what I'm doing here is calculating whether I will kill that enemy before its next turn, because that's the most important thing. Will the kill actually reduce the damage that I take? That's what we need to think about. Can we cancel any enemy moves with the current moves we have available to keep us being the ones taking actions and not taking damage, because it costs money and the entire game might go out the window if you make the wrong decision in this regard. Well, of course, when offered the choice between a solid option and the mystery box, we might as well go for the mystery box, and it turns out to be a decent enough choice because it does kill one of the enemies, and that guy was going to act pretty soon in the turn order. We'll get to work on the other guy, but for the other guy we already have a plan. You might have seen me buffing up my melee guy a second ago, because that moving platform is going to move the melee guy to be standing right next to that enemy. So by giving the guy this melee buff by using an item, his next attack will do extra damage. Here's me wasting time, killing an already dead enemy, the thing I said you probably shouldn't do. Maybe not so bad in that situation, but yes, I'm clearly still focused on doing it. And there's the grand move, so that happened. That's pretty cool. I'm just pointing this out in this stage in particular, because it doesn't really happen for most of the game, like stuff like that. Just interesting things that break the usual turn-based tactics rules. And here's the real profit from doing this. We kill that enemy without spending any cognition, because we've got that buffed up melee attack as an opportunity strike which doesn't cost cognition. Also, we end up with our tech priest near one of the computers which we'll need to kill to reduce the enemy's awakening. I wonder if concern about that computer is why here you see me not attack the enemy after getting them into melee with my servitor. I can't think of any reason to play it like that other than me just not understanding like when I would need to use that attack. Maybe I was saving it because it had its machine spirit charged, which is basically a guaranteed crit you get every other attack with the servitor's melee strike. We don't need it though, because we can use this tech priest to do all of the business for us. It's possible I just wasn't paying attention and didn't realise the servitor had that attack available or something, although that would be a pretty big oversight. I am known for my big oversights. If you saw my chess video recently, I was playing the game in oversight mode, just sort of doing the first thing that came to mind every time. And I do remember thinking that in Mechanicus I really had the opposite view, like I was enjoying thinking of all the possible things you can do. You can get so much out of every turn when you think about it using this cognition point system. Here was an example of me not doing that, so we're still clearly in the early game. We could have advanced and gone towards the enemy, picking up cognition along the way and got ourselves into melee range. But I know why I did it in this case, or why I didn't do that. I was hiding. I was trying to keep my tech priests out of line of sight of the enemy. The game doesn't show you line of sight, but there is a line of sight system, so if you're kind of blocked, the enemy probably won't fire at you. And that's why I was hiding in the corners, letting the servitors do the work. I'm just trying to avoid damage still because of my consciousness about the cost of being damaged. Here's a case where, again, line of sight I guess, and range markers would be nice. I'm trying to work out where I can get ranged raspberry to fire at the enemy across the chasm, and what I'm looking at is towards the top of the screen. As I mouse over various tiles, a little icon appears over the enemy to represent that this enemy is in line of sight from this position. So that's a way of doing it. I don't know, feels like there must be a more intuitive way, or a way that doesn't involve like trying to zoom out and look at two places at once, something like that. Well anyway, we do get the attack using that skill that I like to remove the cognition cost so that I can make it this turn. And that matters to us here because it's the end of the turn. Ending the stage before the turn ticks over means you don't accrue an extra bit of awakening, so we can go on through the next part of the stage one tick earlier, and who knows, that might make the difference to avoiding a full awakening point by the end. Here's another decision to make. There's some sort of signal. Do we look at it? Do we look at it later? Or do we not look at it? And it's like, what's the correct decision? I ended up thinking, well, this middle one sounds like we're sort of looking at it in a safe way. But no, that was the wrong option. This gives the enemy initiative because it was actually a virus or something. Things like that tend to happen where opportunities that seem to come up in the text adventure are usually just a way for you to get punished. Especially in my experience, if you pick options where it's either sending something back to your ship, or an option where you like pray to the Omnissiah, which is our god, to help us. I think this god is real in the canon, not quite sure. Like there is some real magical effects you can get, that's why you have machine spirit abilities on your weapons. And they tend to ignore you, I guess, if you pray for salvation in all sorts of situations. Well, perhaps that's fair. The point is, something perhaps unexpected happened, and we saw that again just there with the glyph, like had to pick a symbol. It's like, do you want this or do you want this? I don't know, I want this. This turned out to be gain 3 health on a unit that already had maximum health. Okay, thanks, I guess. I don't know, it just feels like a missed opportunity, like putting this thing in the game where it's just so arbitrary. Moving on to a random other fight here for whatever reason. I put this here, I remember, just as a clip to be like, and then I continued playing the game, because we want to try and skip forwards, I think. Essentially, the tactics we've seen so far will just carry on. The main considerations were getting enemies into melee, trying not to lose health, which is a consideration shown there, where I didn't damage the enemy to avoid damaging myself, instead wasting that attack, basically shooting a dead enemy. Later on, I cared less and less about killing myself, both because having money later on is less important, like the most important time to have it is at the beginning of the game, and because healing gets easier and easier. Looks like we ultimately complete that stage with no damage taken, and plenty of damage on the disposable troops, that's all good, and we are cashing in, but in exchange we have gained 4 awakening, which is what you want to avoid, so we've still got some progress to make in optimizing our strategy. We've gained here my favourite item in the entire game, the Infestus Mechadendrite or something. I already forgot what it was called. Clearly it is my favourite item indeed. It's an item that does 1 damage to an enemy in melee range. You might think that sounds very unhelpful because most of the time the enemy isn't in melee range, 1 damage isn't very much, and a lot of the time, if the enemy has 1 or more physical armor, that means it doesn't do any damage. However, I use these things constantly throughout the entire game, and you can get some upgraded versions of it as well. And I wanted to throw in a quick rant in favour of doing 1 damage. This is a point where I'm sort of changing my view, I guess. In a lot of games, you can get really small upgrades that feel really lame, and something like doing 1 extra damage sometimes might not feel like a big upgrade. I compare this to things where it's like, you just got plus 2% critical damage or something like that. An attack upgrade that does barely anything, like proportionally it doesn't matter. These are useful in practice, and games are unbalanced if they go further and give you something that actually feels good, because tiny damage increases can have a massive result. This is more true the fewer times you tend to hit enemies before they die, and the more powerful enemies are, and the fewer or more infrequent their turns are. How am I going to explain this? Well, for example, killing an enemy with 2 hits rather than 3 comes with a gigantic future advantage, where killing the enemy slightly earlier than you would have otherwise done prevents them from taking an action which itself might have prevented you from taking an action, and so on. Like, the butterfly effect then works in your favour. And getting plus 1 damage, getting plus 2% attack speed can be the thing that pushes you over that little threshold, because it's not a continuous state of usefulness, your damage. Getting really small increments to your damage can be the thing that makes the big difference, and then getting like even more damage after that won't matter. So while it probably feels more interesting to get like plus 50% damage, getting plus 1 damage is really helpful, and it's particularly true in this game. That's what I'm trying to say. Like, just doing 1 more damage than you thought you were going to do is helpful, and there are various items in the game where it's like, increase the damage of the next attack by 1, and it's like, well, I guess, but the enemy has 15 health, so like doing 1 extra damage kind of feels lame. But no, it really does pan out to be better if you did that 1 extra damage, and it's something where it's hard to know how much of an advantage you ultimately gained, because when you kill the enemy, you don't know if you only just killed it, like, was it going to survive with 1 health and then take an action because you didn't get that plus 1 damage 2 turns ago. It's very hard to look back and analyze how useful it is. These really boring seeming upgrades actually are. And I think I appreciated it in this game when, like, I was at first not interested in lots of the upgrades because of that, where it's like heal 1 HP and things like this, heal 2 HP in fact, as it says. And it's like, is that a big deal? It is a big deal, not only because small differences can make a big practical difference, like if you don't die, that makes a big practical difference, but a lot of the items in the game have quick cooldowns. You can keep using them. This is particularly true of the thing, the Infestus Mechadendrite, because you can use it every single turn. And doing 1 extra damage every turn, potentially on every character, which is how I ended up setting it up, does stack up. It makes a big difference in the end, in that while it's making a small difference, that small difference fits perfectly in the gap between you doing really well and you doing really badly, because that's how big the gap is. If the enemy in the game are powerful, simply stopping them from doing one additional thing is powerful. So you're avoiding big trouble if the enemy can inflict big trouble upon you by using only a very small amount of trouble on your side, if that small amount of trouble pushes you over some sort of milestone in terms of damage. So what I'm doing here is making the world's lamest and vaguest argument in favour of doing 1 damage, in contrast to what I felt when initially playing the game and thinking these upgrades sound lame. And in most games when it's like that, I always think these upgrades sound lame. But it is technically true, like mathematically, if you had like an AI that could simulate everything, you'd find out that those were useful upgrades. It just doesn't feel like they are. So what we all need to do is basically just believe. That's essentially what I'm putting forward as the new like game appreciation strategy. When the game you're playing has some really boring looking upgrades where it's like, oh, plus 2% resistance to this thing that only happens sometimes. Do I want to actually do that? Like, was that worth the effort of unlocking? I want you to believe that it was, somehow. And in fact, there's more. But wait, there's more. The Infestus Mechadendrite thing doesn't only do 1 damage, it also makes the enemy get knocked back by 1 tile. And you'll probably see that throughout this video somewhere. This is occasionally useful because of this thing where being within 1 tile proximity to an enemy means you're in melee, and you can't use certain weapons when you're in melee. Having a thing that knocks the enemy back a tile is occasionally a way to get out of melee, although I didn't use it for that very often as it turns out. Extremely occasionally, you can do something like knock an enemy into melee with a different character, which will trigger their opportunity attack right away because of the turn order or something. But very rarely is something as cool as that going to be available. It's just not quite a sort of into the breach level of tactics game. This is actually something worthy of mention because it reminded me that throughout the game, or at the beginning of the game I should say, what I thought you would be able to do is knock the enemy off ledges. You might have seen that in most stages there are like bottomless pits everywhere. This doesn't factor into the game at all, and I completely expected it to, like from the beginning. So I eventually discovered, like once you've unlocked certain attacks which move the enemy about a bit, which there aren't very many of in the game, but there's a couple, and that little item is one of them. What you can't do is push the enemy off cliffs. And I had been looking forward to doing that because there are cliffs everywhere in every stage. So again, there's this idea that the stages are really just cosmetic. Like there are various sectors and you walk through them and they look a bit different, but it all just doesn't matter. It feels underutilized. Having more stage hazards would be fun, or turning the stage hazards that already appear to be there, like bottomless pits, into actual gameplay mechanics could be good as well. It's the sort of thing where it would be hideously overpowered because like the AI probably wouldn't know to avoid standing on the edge of the cliff and you just constantly be pushing like really powerful enemies off cliffs. It's probably annoying from a balancing point of view to make a game where you can do really powerful things like that. However, I wanted to do it. Like, you know, I'm not letting you off the hook, game developers. That is your problem to solve. You don't have to look to me and be like, well, it would have been hard for us to do it. Yeah, I know. You still should have done it. Wherever, it's your problem. Don't complain to me about it. Find a way to make that work. I want to push this immortal being into the bottomless pit that it's stupidly built into its own home. We should use that to our advantage, right? We're the Mechanicus. Shouldn't we be thinking of things like this? Who knows? Here I've come up with a genius method of getting through the Glyph decisions. What you can do is open up your Steam guides with Shift Tab and look up what the glyphs do. I actually do that quite badly here, clicking on the wrong button at first. I need a guide for how to look up the guide, it seems. Well anyway, usually I would make a big song and dance about not doing this and being like, well, if there was a "you're just supposed to know" mechanic, I would deliberately not know if the game didn't tell me, in order to make some sort of point, being like, there game, do you see the consequences of your actions? You can't rely on somebody looking up a walkthrough for something. Well here, we're just gonna do it, because I don't want the downside of not knowing in this particular "you're just supposed to know" mechanic. It's a case where this mechanic is trivial if you've already played the game before, like you're allowed to just remember the answer and put it in again next time. So, because, as I think I mentioned before, I'm not playing this game with the intent of playing it again, I just want everything the first time through, and that means I sort of have to go to the walkthrough to get the stuff where it's like, here are mechanics designed only for your second playthrough. and the game is probably balanced around that to some extent. So maybe you're supposed to get it right, basically, with the glyphs, that's what I'm saying. And it's difficult to get it right if you don't have any idea what you're looking at, and I wonder to what extent the developers kind of internalize that and fit that into the balancing of the game. I don't know. Long story short, I'm now cheating, which essentially will give me extra money now and again, sometimes useless extra health like right there, and that's probably going to help out in some way. Now we're going to look at something that doesn't help though, so let's get into this. Here's a random fight where we're first enjoying some nice area of effect attacks. When you're fighting the flayed ones, you actually get a little indicator pointing at who they're going to attack next, so it's a little bit more tactical, I guess, in that regard, and you can even change who they're going to attack through your own actions. But that's not what we're here to talk about today. We need to look at this action. I have now got some flamethrowers, and I was very eager to use them over here. There are 2 enemies who I can set on fire, and that will do burning damage over several turns, so it's nice to set them on fire as early as possible. After that, what I could do is, well, you can see it from the movement range, I can do basically anything. I can run all over this map. What I'm going to do though is not much, and that's going to be a big mistake. And what I learned over the course of the campaign is that you should essentially do as much as possible with every character and not really focus on saving cognition points for other characters unless you have something particular in mind. Because if I'd run away, for example, or just gone round the corner, like moved a couple of tiles to the left, all of these enemies wouldn't be able to see my character out there. And that is a problem, because if you look at the top, the enemy are about to take like 5 or 6 turns in a row. We have a very bad setup here, where they're all going to be targeting this guy. Even the flayed one, which the game says is supposed to be targeting someone else, actually also targets that guy. Maybe that was coincidence. He was standing at the end of that flayed one's movement range. Just bad luck, I guess, but it's also bad gameplay, that's what I'm saying. And the reason I bring this up is, as you can see, things are not going very well. We almost die, but then I get the chance to intervene because it's the end of the turn, and we can deploy more troops. So I immediately throw somebody down over there to the left. My theory was that this basically takes care of business, because the enemy will target the stuff that's nearer to them, giving me the chance to act at some point and deal with the situation. Also, sometimes if you put a troop down, they take the next action, like they get put at the front of the next turn right after they deploy. Not sure when that's the case, but sometimes that seems to happen. In this case, it is not the case. So what is the case? We have lost Melee Mick. He was just completely piled upon, and that's the end of that. We could have saved him, as I said, with a couple of easy actions, but I really wasn't thinking of doing them. It's only immediately after it's like, oh, yeah, so I was under big risk there, now I realise. And here's where not being able to just reload the save like you can in the normal gameplay settings is going to be a big problem, and I'm poking around here being like, is there anything I can do about this? Because while normally I'm fine with just Ironmanning things and sort of letting bad things happen in these campaigns just for the drama and just to have something to talk about, in this case I was very concerned that this would actually ruin the campaign, for the simple reason that with Permadeath, when you only have 3 characters, losing 1 character is losing a massive amount of the stuff you can do in the game, and that's going to lead to more losses inevitably. So now we have to ask, are we in a soft failure state? I know now the answer is no, because we're going to carry on this campaign commentary, as you'll see. But at the time, I was very concerned, and I was basically thinking, should I just quit the game? Or should I even start again? But it took so long to get here that starting again was probably not really going to be viable. Should I just give up on playing the game and make a different video? Because what I don't want is for this relatively large proportional loss, like losing a third of your strength, losing a third of the resources I've invested in my characters as well. I don't want that to mean that in 10 missions time I've built up enough damage on characters, or maybe lost another character as well, and things are bad enough that I can't finish the game. I don't know how good I need to be to finish the game, and because it's super positive feedback loopy, it is plausible that in this situation I could have lost the campaign from here, or because of specifically what happened here, and I should quit the game for maximum real life time efficiency. That isn't the case, because the game isn't quite that hard, or it gets easier more than I thought it would. However, I think it's reasonable to have that fear, I guess, that's what I'm saying, and that's something that impacted my enjoyment of the game. the concern that I wasn't going to be able to finish the game and the pressure to start the game again, which I think I touched on already, was there. And it was just annoying me, and it's going to annoy me for a long time here and just drag the game down a little bit more. So something to think about there. Here's a little extra gut punch you get. If you lose a character, you still have to pay to heal them, even though they're dead. So we lose more than the resources we gained from completing this mission because we lost that character, just to make things that extra bit harder. I suppose what's actually going on is the way the permadeath mechanic works is you just don't get the character back when you heal them from death. Most likely in vanilla settings, you would pay that 150 Blackstone and just get your character back. Here, you pay and then you don't get the character back. It feels like maybe they were a little bit too hasty about adding this permadeath mechanics specifics. Like, it should have been that you don't pay if the character actually dies, something like that. Because, I don't know, what am I paying for in that situation? It was an expensive funeral, let's just say that, who knows. Well, anyway, the big point is that from here, I was genuinely just thinking about quitting the game and wondering if I should keep playing, and about the possibility of it. And this is another case where if this had been a casual playthrough, like on my own, I would have stopped. I think I said already I would have stopped right at the beginning because I wasn't having very much fun. I started having some more fun, but here was another like kick-out point where it's like, I don't care anymore. Like, it's not worth the risk of playing to a soft failure state, or being in a soft failure state and playing to the fail state. My instinct was to start again and use what I learned to do better. But because the game's very slow, like, it's not obvious because I'm cutting out so much of the game, but these missions last like 40 minutes, these things that I'm showing for 10 seconds now and again. So I didn't want to do it again. However, I didn't want to keep playing because I was afraid that I would fail, leaving me in a difficult mental state with the game. The game wasn't entertaining at this stage. This is like a torment that I'm in. To some extent, this is my own fault, both because it's my own hang-ups that I'm talking about, and it's because you don't have to play on permadeath Ironman mode. I'm essentially recommending against playing like that because it caused me all of these annoyances, and I wished I wasn't on this mode most of the time. However, once again, the I'm making this for content mode kicks in, where it's like, well, now, even if everything goes wrong, we'll just talk about that. So what I'll do is try and play like a couple more missions to see if I like immediately fail and hope that failure state comes really quickly. And then we could conclude the video by just saying, and then I lost because of this, it was too much of a loss. Talk about the opportunity cost of not having such a major part of your force or something like that. And we would have some more things to talk about. Unfortunately, my third character, the ranged raspberry guy, turned out to be so powerful and quickly got so powerful that he started carrying us through most of the game until I found even more powerful things. So we're essentially going to now take a look at how we come back from taking this theoretically very major loss, and how the game gets suspiciously easy as I come back, which invites the sort of reverse point that I'm making here, that while I'm saying, oh, I'm under so much pressure, it's so difficult to lose one character, you can't make it like that, my instinct that I was in huge trouble here turned out to be wrong because we just weren't in huge trouble later on. And, well, I just found that interesting. Like, I was so dejected, I just thought there's no way a game where you have 3 characters and you permanently lose one would still even be possible to finish. Like, it shouldn't be possible to complete a game like that. That's essentially what I'm saying. Like, if there's any balance, that's such a huge proportional loss. Your margins for victory can't be that wide that you can lose that much of your power and still win. Well, maybe they are. And this is the one thing I had seen about this game, the one like comment I already knew about it. People saying it's unbalanced in the player's favor. And so far in my playthrough, I was like not agreeing with that essentially, because I was having a difficult and stressful time and such, as I was saying. But it's just because there are certain strategies that are unbalanced in the player's favor, as we'll see. And there are actually some hints about that right at the beginning. If you saw that difficulty menu I popped up at the very beginning of this video, it had all these things where it's like, disable this feature, disable that feature. Those were clues, I now know, because what probably happened was players complained that the game is too easy, and the developers added modes to just switch off the things that the players thought were good, so that they could play in the sort of miserable way that they wanted to, like disabling ranged weapons and things like that. So if I'd been reading the difficulty menu really closely, I could have been like, so people are saying cognition movement is overpowered because the developers have given you the chance to turn it off at the beginning. Something like that. We could have done some real big-brained meta-considerations to work out the best strategy before even playing the game. However, we're going to do it through playing the game, and I'm probably going to find something to say about it. Now it's time for another not pictured here comment. Because I found a solution to one of the big problems I had with the game, and by found I mean I read it because somebody else found the problem on a Steam forum. What I'm talking about is I'm now using Cheat Engine, so yes, it sounds like I'm cheating even more when I say that, but we're using Cheat Engine without any cheat tables loaded, if you know what that means. Essentially, we're using speed hacks. We've got a program running in the background that causes Mechanicus to run at, I think I put it at 1.5 speed the entire time. This will speed up the various moments where you lose control, like right here I said heal, the UI goes away, we wait for the heal, and now we can do the next thing, and as I ranted about earlier, that's unnecessary. But it becomes less egregious if it's going in fast motion, and that's basically the secret to it. I think what I did at first was what somebody on the internet recommended, which was binding the caps lock key to toggling the speed up on and off, so maybe I'm turning it off and on here, I don't remember. Eventually, I just left it on permanently, and that was pretty much fine. There are a couple of possible glitches that were caused by this, which maybe we'll see later. But broadly speaking, the game is absolutely fine to run at 1.5 speed. It doesn't look like it's out of control here or anything, does it? And the argument can still be made that it's still too slow, like, why do I have to wait for the healing animation to finish before I give the next order? They can happen simultaneously, those things, like there's no reason to stop the player interacting with the game there, and the game has to be held to account for that, at least that's what I say anyway. Here's another random thing that happened now and again, that suspicious activity thing that popped up for a second. I still don't, even after finishing the game, understand what that even was, but it happened, I don't know, maybe in like 1 in 10 missions. You could walk somewhere and it would say suspicious activity detected and cause more enemies to spawn. There's some kind of invisible tripwire system where sometimes moving to a certain part of the map will spawn more enemies. And I mentioned earlier, I was already sort of annoyed by the way that more enemies spawn into a mission as the mission goes on, because so often your mission is to kill all of the enemies, and by so often I mean almost always. Something where more enemies show up kind of throws spanners in the works, and I just didn't want the spanners to be in the works because my works are already really clogged up with spanners, by which I mean I'm under pressure, as I was putting it earlier. So right here, we're already at 5 awakening, the mission's going really badly, and it's just because we only have 2 characters. It takes ages to kill the enemies, which is both annoying in real life, and in-game, because there's a global time limit, taking your time and slowly winning the game isn't an acceptable way to play. So things are going poorly, and for the game to be like, and now here are some more enemies, that's just annoying. You might have noted the actual goal was to scan that thing, but almost always, if the mission objective says it's to scan a thing, it will also ask you to kill all the enemies. So there are 2 kinds of mission, the one where you kill all the enemies and the one where it says scan the thing. But when you scan the thing, it will say, and now kill all the enemies, almost always. So basically there's one kind of mission, and that adds to the repetition of the game. There is an incredibly rare third kind, where the mission is to walk somewhere on the map. Those are the best missions by a huge margin, and maybe we'll see them later on. They're incredibly rare for some reason, but yes, I really enjoyed those missions because the tactical considerations are just different. So there's the result of that battle. We lost all of the troops we took, we got massive awakening, and the question is, again, soft locking, or soft failure states. Are we stuck here because our game progress is going to be so poor, we're going to gain so much awakening by doing these 50-minute, really long missions with only a couple of characters, that maybe we'll just lose the game later because of this? We're probably playing too badly for this to be a sustainable playstyle. Well, I just kept going to see if things would change. Turns out they do, which we'll see. We've got Ranged Raspberry to level 10, or 11 here actually. Once you get to level 10, you've maxed out your first class if you're focusing it down. And for Ranged Raspberry, that gives him extra damage on range attacks if he doesn't carry a melee weapon, which we're not going to. So we've got a really powerful ranged character, and that's going to be useful in all circumstances, essentially more useful than having a really powerful melee character, essentially, because a ranged character can do more things with their turn. So we now have to decide what's their second class going to be, because you can keep leveling them up and make them good at something else instead. And we'll come back to decisions like that because I was essentially making them incorrectly most of the time. And I was also very samey, like I tended to push all of my priests towards being exactly the same because it's easier to play that way, or easier to strategize, I guess. Well, we'll see. There was an example, which I wanted to include, of me using the Infestus thing to push an enemy back, thus unlocking a ranged attack, which you can't otherwise do in melee. And check out how quick those animations were. They were like 1 second. It's much more, I don't know, in the right rhythm, I guess. Like, you don't feel like you're waiting longer than you want to. When the animation only takes like 1 second or less, you've kind of like spent that second cooling down, being like, yep, that was that action, and you're ready to take the next action at roughly the time when the next action is available. So it's much more intuitive to play like this. Intuitive isn't the correct word. I don't know what I'm talking about. It's got better game feel. Let's just throw that one out there. That's always a reliable thing to say. And it's one of these cases where once you start playing it like this, it just feels stupid, the original game. It's like, why wasn't it like this from the beginning? I always feel like this with speed-ups for some reason. I remember saying the same thing about Mount and Blade Bannerlord, because playing that with a higher game speed is so much more fun and it's easier as well. And I just thought, why wasn't it like this? Was this just never considered? Star Sector was the other big one, where it's really slow, but once you install a mod that makes it run at double speed or even 4 times speed, it's like, well, this feels like a normal game now. And I'm getting something similar with this. Running it at 1.5 times speed feels okay. You could probably bump it up a little bit more as well, and it would still feel intuitive, like not so fast it's out of control or anything like that. Here's some good news. A mission comes up that allows us to unlock a new tech priest. I was generally doing missions that unlock troops, because I thought I'd try and unlock the full roster of troops. We've got all the generic troops right now, which aren't anything to write home about. Basically, you have 2 melee guys and 2 ranged guys doing either energy or physical damage. Here's an example of a fight which I remember was part of the reason I started getting into this Infestus Mechadendrite thing. There's a new kind of enemy that starts appearing from this point in the game, which can melee attack you from anywhere on the map by just jumping at you. So you're much more likely from here on to be in melee, which is the situation where that Mechadendrite thing is useful. Also, because it locks you in melee, you might get stuck having to face an opportunity attack, so the knockback ability is also handy. This is also an example right here, where the enemy's standing on the edge of a ledge, and you just wish you could push them off the ledge and just kill them instantly. That would be pretty cool. Instead, I'm doing some clever positioning to make sure that when I use my ranged attacks here, I hit myself to the lowest possible extent, and we can just about avoid hitting my own character stuck in melee there. That's going to be another downside to being forced into melee. Lots of area of effect attacks have to be used very carefully if you're just going to be hitting your own troops at the same time. Or maybe you could just do that anyway and it's fine. Since you have options for healing, and broadly speaking the enemy doesn't, it's more okay for you to take damage because you might be able to just heal it immediately. Now, I wanted to show you the rest of this turn, not for any good reason, but as usual for a bad reason. I just want to demonstrate how long it takes to do things, really, which is the big takeaway that's probably not being put across in this video very well. You can spend 2 minutes on your turn, especially if you're thinking about what to do, and by your turn I mean like one character's turn. Here what I'm considering is probably, is it better to kill one of the enemies or use area of effect attacks to damage both of them, because it might not kill one of them, and based on the turn order, you would reduce the amount of damage you're likely to take if you make some inefficient attacks that also kill the enemy, that sort of thing. So we could like overkill the enemy at the back here and do less damage with our turn, but also guarantee a kill that will stop the enemy taking an action somewhat soon. So that's the sort of thing we're thinking about with that. Probably, anyway, maybe I was acting purely at random, that's also an option. Looks like we're going to do that thing that I just said, so we do way more damage than we need to, so we've sort of wasted a bunch of damage there to kill that enemy at the back, but at least they're not going to damage us, that's the consideration. We'll move back into melee and start slapping at this guy, thus returning to my point, and we all know what it was. I think the point was just that this takes a long time, and well, we've sped it up, so it normally takes longer than this. This thing that I'm showing you for 2 minutes takes 3 minutes in the base game, or the regular game settings, and maybe it shouldn't. I feel like with more clever animation stuff, you could get away with this, but then again, this is just what the genre is like. It's supposed to be slow and clunky to some extent, because you're supposed to be thinking about things and just kind of watching the outcomes of your actions. It's less like you're playing as the characters in the game, more like you're instructing the game to do things and then watching them happen. More strategy gamey, as I was talking about earlier. And what I wonder is there real value there? If you moved away from that, as certain games do, like Valkyria Chronicles, are you actually losing anything? Because you certainly gain something. The only question to me is, like, what do you lose? Is there a kind of game feel associated with the slow, like, step-by-step procedure style of gameplay that needs to be preserved by having it be slow? I'm just wondering whether it's worth saying it shouldn't be like this, like bang, slam, objective game design point made. Is there value in this that I just can't feel? Because I feel like I used to like this kind of game, but I stopped liking it when I saw games that were better. Maybe this is just an artifact of the past, this way of presenting gameplay action. Or maybe there's something I just don't get, and something really would be lost in not preserving it and having this step-by-step procedure gameplay style. I don't believe my instincts. I don't trust myself when I think, this is definitely the worst way of doing it. I'm like, am I sure? Am I sure? Like, I don't really have a good reason for saying that. Well, if anybody in the comments has a good reason for me, please write it in the comments and we'll all agree that it was my point all along. So as you can see, we now have 3 tech priests, so we've got another character getting us back in the game. And once again, because you have only very few characters, moving up from 2 to 3 is a massive power increase in theory, although this guy has like no skill, so he's just sort of there to absorb damage at this stage. We'll work something out for them and make them useful at some point. The point is, though, that we're now slightly back in the game. But of course, when playing, I couldn't have known that, so it's all well and good me saying like, it was fine, like we got another tech priest and things started to work out eventually. There was no way to know that would happen, and even now at this stage, as our recovery begins in earnest, there's no way of knowing whether this recovery will be enough to finish the game and keep up with the increasing difficulty curve. And that's only because, well, basically this is a critique of Ironman permadeathing a game you've never played before, doing like the most unblind playthrough friendly blind playthrough of a game makes things unsatisfactory in some cases. I'm blaming somebody else for this, even though it was my idea. And again, I think we all agree that's probably the most fair thing to do. You might have noticed we're now in a new biome, so to speak, to use the Against the Storm language again for no reason. We're in the yellow area. In the yellow area, sometimes there are these yellow barriers, which will only go away when the turn ends. That means that in cases like this, where I'm completely blocked off from all of the enemies for my first turn, I can't really do very much in the first turn. It's a shame because trying to do as much as you can with your first turn became my favoured strategy, and I think it's probably the best strategy. But the other thing to mention is just that it's an example of a possible difference between the biomes, where they have added some kind of stage hazard, I guess. Well, it's not really a hazard, and maybe that's the point to make. It would be cool if you could do something with this, like trap the enemies in a zone that kills them or something. It's really just like as basic as it can be, and it feels like they started doing something there, where if they had kept going, it would help counter the fact that the missions are all basically the same thing. It looks like things are going okay, we're not taking too much damage, although we took lots of awakening, we got lots of awakening. The Necrons are waking up, we were too noisy. That means fewer missions before the end of the game in theory, and I don't know whether it's worth trying to really keep awakening down early on when it's kind of difficult to do so. But we're going to start moving on to a phase when dealing with awakening is going to become easier, and a lot of my previous worries about it didn't matter so much in the end. One reason for that is you start getting more often these little bonus stages within the missions, where sometimes a room, instead of a text adventure puzzle thing, will have a little fight, and these are more like puzzle combats, I guess, in that you can usually complete them really fast, very often in the first turn, and it's simply a test of can you kill like 2 enemies really quickly and not get any more awakening. And the answer is usually yes in my experience, so I did enjoy these stages because it's just fun to think about, like a really short combat puzzle in this game's mechanics. And generally speaking, these missions are kind of better than like the main missions, for the simple reason that they're more rewarding and they're faster as well, which I appreciated. As you see here, you get bonus rewards for doing these missions, including reducing awakening. So we made a net profit there in terms of awakening by completing it without any rounds passing, so no awakening went up during the stage. You still get +2 for initiating the fight because you always get 2 points of awakening when you enter a room, which is kind of annoying, but because these missions can reduce your awakening by 4, walking towards a mission, as I did just here, which gained me 4 awakening, this is like sub-awakening points I'm talking about here, it's okay, because during the mission there will probably be a console to destroy, which reduces it by another 2 sub-points. And that was an example of that. We got loads of rewards, more stuff than you normally get for doing fights, and we reduced awakening, and it was fun, and we didn't take any damage. Essentially, those little battles, which come up sometimes, like randomly as far as I can tell, in missions, are more fun than the main game. And I think the reason for that is that when you do normal missions, not only are the rewards lower and the punishments greater, the actual reason you're doing them is like a text adventure reason, it's part of the plot. So, for example, I think I showed something earlier where you were trying to deploy incense in the tombs, which would do something. And the thing is, it doesn't do something, because there are no mechanical changes that come from actually completing the story mission objectives. That's why, well, I'm just not mentioning them at all. They do not matter. And that's a shame, because if I wanted to put incense in the tombs because it did something, it would feel like more of a reward to go and do that mission. Instead, doing the random sub-missions are more rewarding because they give you more money and help you with the global time limit stress a lot more than the normal missions do. So it's a strange little situation. No easy way to solve that, obviously, without making the game more mechanically deep and complex. But because they had the opportunity to do so, because they're talking about it being more complex in the plot, and it just isn't. I don't know, it's making things worse than it could be. Maybe they just shouldn't have mentioned anything. Maybe there should be no plot. That's a pretty bold thing to say. I'm not quite sure. In a certain circumstance, the plot makes the game feel shallow, because the plot is deeper than the game is. Let's call it ludonarrative disappointment, as a parody on ludonarrative dissonance, that sort of thing. Maybe it's the same sort of thing I was complaining about in Homeworld Deserts of Karak as well. I think I'm just a dreamer here, guys. I always think of more interesting mechanics that the game implies, and then get disappointed, and then think, well, the game's bad for not doing that thing I imagined that it should have done after it was developed. Something. Invent time travel. Make Mechanicus better. Well, this mission's going pretty well, at least, because there were 3 computers to blow up, and essentially going for the computers became my only strategy in missions. I tried to do it first and foremost to just get the awakening off the table. There was a nice finish where our ranged attack kills both an enemy and the computer. Our ranged attacks have gotten powerful enough to do that, that's the point to mention there. I mentioned earlier my ranged character became overpowered, and that was essentially the case. Like, the ranged character does the same damage as your melee characters, or less specialized ranged characters, but they do it to multiple enemies per turn, which just makes them disproportionately powerful compared to other units and other tech priests. But there's even more powerful stuff to find, as we'll see. So we did the thing. They mentioned there probably what the thing was. Does it matter? Not even slightly. The actual reward is just whatever like randomly generated item it gives you after the mission. And, well, the real reward actually here is that we did it with 0 awakening. So that's more like it. We've just made some progress in the game. We've got resources to make ourselves stronger, but we didn't bring on the final boss. So this is a more player-controlled feeling situation. We're just making preparations. We comfortably didn't advance the global time limit. And this is going to turn out to be possible, actually, in most of the missions. And that's why my impression of the global time limit became less negative. It's simply because it became less of a big deal. So I want to sort of focus down on that and double back and say, well, wait a second. Actually, in the early game, I was annoyed by the global time limit, so I don't want to let them off the hook. I was feeling under pressure and sort of feeling like I enjoyed the experience less, knowing that every mistake was going to be punished again later, that sort of thing. And while that is a valid game design, I guess I'm saying I didn't enjoy it. It's the sort of mechanic that's more fun if you're really good at the game and you can sort of master it and know where it's going. But the first time you play through, not so much. A recurring theme in this commentary, this game isn't very good the first time unless you're really good at it, or something like that. Like, the game is fun when it's easy, but the game's also too easy, so it's in a difficult situation, or it becomes too easy, I should say. Well, anyway, I don't care so much about the global time limit now. I'm pretty sure it was ruining the game for me at some point, but only in a sort of back of my mind sort of way. I was just aware that the time limit was ticking up, and I was only really not worrying about it because I thought if everything goes wrong, that's drama for the content. If I'd been playing casually, I would have been annoyed about the prospect of not knowing if everything was going to go wrong and whether I was wasting my time playing the game because, well, it is a very time-wasty sort of game because it takes a long time. As you might have noted, like in the last 10 minutes, we shot through 2-3 hours of gameplay. Like, I'm really skipping over everything here. Actually doing the turn-based tactics and inputting your commands takes a long time. That's also the part of the game that I liked, so I'm conveniently in this commentary cutting out the good part just to make sure I always have something bad to say about the game. But yes, I enjoyed the game enough, like in the off-camera things that I'm not showing here. It's too difficult to really explain that. Just the thought process behind all of the turn-based tactics I thought was neat and deep and gave you lots of choices, which I really enjoyed. Well, that's enough good things. Let's say a bad thing. Actually, this isn't a bad thing. We're going here into a boss fight. The thing I wanted to say about this boss fight is that when I was playing at this stage, I still didn't know I was supposed to do this. I think that's the bad thing I was thinking of. I came into this boss fight because the reward for doing this was that it reduced the cost of deploying troops. And I was thinking, because I have fewer tech priests than I'm quote-unquote supposed to, I need to rely on troops more than the average player. Like, the game isn't balanced around using troops to the extent I will have to use them now. So, I should focus down on getting more troops, leveling them up, and getting this thing that reduces their usage cost. It doesn't reduce it by very much, as I recall. It's something like 30% reduction, but because using a troop costs like 20, you might save 10 to 20 Blackstone per mission if you bring a few troops with this bonus, so it's not actually that important. But it's something to do, isn't it? And the good news is that it forced me to do a boss fight and ultimately caused me to work out that this is what you're supposed to be doing in the game. So the point to make is the same thing I made earlier, as usual, back at it again with the repetition and the time wasting. The game probably should have made it more clear that killing the bosses was our objective in the game. Or is it the objective in the game? I don't know. It seems like it is. I think what actually happens, sort of speculating on the thing I didn't see here, is if you just play the game without doing the boss fights because they're optional, it will just force you to do them as the final boss or something like that because, well, we'll see why I think that later on. The point is, I'm fighting a strong Necron, and, well, the boss fights are kind of gimmick stages in that, as you saw out on the main map, you don't really explore the tomb at all. You just go down a linear path to build up tons of awakening and, well, build up some damage in our case, but if you're lucky, maybe you get some bonuses along the way. And then you fight a guy in an arena, so these are more like handcrafted arenas that are a little bit different to the normal missions. In this case, we have a new enemy being introduced at the same time, the Varguard. This is an enemy that will teleport in to take damage when you make an attack. So essentially, in any stage where there is a Varguard, the Varguard will constantly block your attacks using its health bar until it dies. In practice, that's okay because you end up just killing the Varguard and you have to do that anyway, so it's not a huge journey out of your way to kill this guy instead of the original target. But it is a problem in this stage in particular because your only goal here is to kill the boss. You don't have to kill the enemies. So having the boss teleport away every time you attack him makes things difficult, of course. So in practice, we're going to have to kill most of the enemies, and the other bosses are actually easier than this because you don't have to do it, and focusing down the objective is more plausible. If only I knew, as usual. We've stumbled into doing things the harder way, but, well, I think in this case there's no other way to get around it. This is the quote-unquote first boss, I think. I'm not quite sure. The bosses are sort of in an order because each boss is like the ruler of each biome, each sector of the tomb. And I still don't know how you unlock the bosses because I never unlocked them all, as you'll see. But it's something to do with the text adventures, I think. I think sometimes in the random text adventures you see in tombs, someone will say, oh, as a result of examining this thing, we now know who the ruler of this section of the tomb is, or something like that. I can't remember. Again, the game doesn't explicitly tell you what it is that's unlocking the bosses, I don't think. Or at the very least, I didn't notice them being unlocked and just occasionally was like, oh, there are bosses in the mission list, like when did that happen? Because the characters never talk about it, and as I said, don't make it clear that they sort of want to kill the bosses and that this is the objective of the game. It's all just flying by. I thought this was all some pointless optional challenge. It might actually be the main quest, and I shouldn't even be confused about that. Even the stupidest player shouldn't be confused about that, so let's make it a little bit more clear. Here's a nice kind of mistake that I made a whole bunch of times throughout the campaign, and I'm making it right here in the boss. I kept deploying servitors behind enemies that were in melee. I had this idea in my head that this was worth something. It's not really, there's no like rear attack or any concept of flanking in this game. So while often I would deploy behind the enemy, this puts you at a disadvantage because if you have stuff behind the enemy, lots of the area of effect attacks are probably going to hit them because they tend to hit behind more than they do in front. So, we've screwed ourselves over here, although this servitor is going to prove useful. You saw I used a little ability on the servitor, which provokes enemies into attacking them. So if you're in melee and you have this ability, you can force the next melee attacks to be against the servitor. Handy because healer Harry here was nearly dead standing in the melee. Luckily, being a healer, we can get our health back pretty quick. Now we're going to pull off the master stroke of this plan, which is where the area of effect thing comes in. I want to use the flamethrower on the boss to set them on fire and get that ticking damage over time, but to do so I also now have to attack the servitor because I put them in a stupid place. I could have put them like slightly off to the side, and then we would have had an angle where I don't have to attack myself. As you can see, I just attacked myself anyway, because well, that's what the servitors are for. They're like your lowest of the low foot soldiers who nobody cares about. So, we do that. The servitor handily doesn't die and thus does take the incoming melee attack of the boss. Well, after he does this boss keeps summoning additional troops. You can see Necrons all over the place. I am just ignoring them. I think that's like a trap to try and force you into fighting these other guys, and you should just ignore them in this stage. Instead, we're going to shoot everything we have at the boss and just tank any incoming damage. This works out pretty good, and we do end up killing the boss. We end up killing with an energy attack, even though the boss is strong against energy attacks with tons of energy armor. Because, as I said, ranged raspberry is so powerful it doesn't matter anymore. We can just do the thing that he's not very good at and it's still just as good as everybody else. Something. The boss is dead, and the question here is, where's the fanfare? Like, again, an opportunity for the characters to be like, yes, we killed that guy. That's going to insert reason why we need to kill them here, thus informing the player of these reasons. I don't know, I still don't really know what's going on with the boss system, and I'm going to keep mentioning it. At least we got some good rewards. I've got that troop thing I mentioned, and we have some better equipment, including a better energy ranged weapon for ranged raspberry, so we're still moving up in the world right here. But what we don't get is any kind of long-term benefit, I guess, from killing the boss. This is the same thing I mentioned before, where all the story objectives don't actually do anything mechanically. You'd think like killing the boss would make fighting in that boss's sector easier or something. No, it doesn't. Just kind of feels like it should. Like these mechanics are sitting there, like on the floor. Please do something with these mechanics, game. No, okay, we'll just walk past them, that's fine. Well, moving on, here's me killing some Necron computer things to reduce some awakening. Going to do it again right here. In fact, with ranged raspberry back at it again, we can use his machine spirit charged pistol, which we can fire for free. You can see the area of effect is massive, and because he does extra damage with his ranged attacks, we kill the computer and 2 enemies, and even one of our own soldiers. That's how powerful the attack was. Pretty good. And we can pick up the 2 cognition dropped from the killed enemies. To just keep our turn going now, I can have ranged raspberry gradually cognition move all the way across the map. So at this stage I'd gotten used to this idea that while it looks like you can only have 2 turns of movement per turn, it refreshes and you can just keep getting it back and move as many times as you want. We get to this thing, scan the thing, a bunch of enemies appear, and then the mission handily just ends before any trouble comes of that. So that was nice of them. Usually it would say kill all the enemies, but I guess it doesn't register those guys spawning until the end of your turn or something, and the check for victory came first. So we didn't have to do the usual extra objective, getting us out of this mission with only 1 awakening, so that's pretty neat. Now here's another mission where I wanted to highlight the start of this particular battle because something went wrong, and I remember thinking there was some kind of bullshit reason, like I was outraged at how badly this went. And looking back on it, it's not really that bullshit at all. you can see what's going on is I deployed right next to the enemy. Normally that's pretty useful because you can get into combat faster, kill them faster, that sort of stuff. You want to be as far forward as possible in your deployment in order to get to all of the stuff and do more stuff during your turn. But as you could see, this went incredibly poorly. There were two slightly bullshitty things actually. You might have seen one of the enemies shot through a gap between two props. Normally, line of sight is more basic than that. Like, even if you theoretically could see through something or around something. So it probably looked like the position I was deploying into was less in the line of sight of enemies than it actually was. But still, it was very in the line of sight of enemies. The thing I ignored was that the enemies were going to get the first like 5 turns, which actually very rarely happens. You almost always get the first turns in all battles. It's possible the enemy had an initiative bonus, which can happen where it makes them go first. Clearly I wasn't paying enough attention and things went wrong, and the other bullshit thing was that the enemy got a critical hit, which I think ignores your armor and maybe does more damage as well, can't quite remember. I don't know what the chance of receiving a critical hit is, it's just another part of the RNG damage. It's something like 10%, I would guess. Like, occasionally you can also do a critical hit. I can't remember. The point is, we lost Healer Harry just all of a sudden, like unexpectedly to me, but looking back at the footage, there was reason to expect that I was making a terrible move there. I just wasn't thinking about it at the time, which of course is going to be a problem for somebody playing on Ironman Permadeath mode. And, well, the problem is what I wanted to talk about. As I mentioned earlier, I was like in a fit of depression at the idea of losing one character in a game where you only have a couple of characters. Now I've lost 2 characters. What am I going to do with that? I am now much less powerful than I'm quote-unquote supposed to be. So if I was worried about being in a soft fail state before, I'm definitely in it now. That's essentially what I was thinking. But I'm kind of committed to the meme. I was like, well, I'll just keep playing. I'll just see what happens. Maybe I'll lose in the next stage and I'll be freed from my trials of having to constantly play this game and be depressed by it. Who knows? However, at the back there, we unlocked a giant robot for completing that mission. That's a troop you can deploy. It's got tons of health, more health than your tech priests most of the time. It also does more damage than your tech priests most of the time. You also have an infinite supply of them. If that's starting to sound pretty useful, yes, it is. And it only just begins here. Like, that thing at the back there is now going to be the main thing we use to complete the game. And the game's about to get significantly memeier with this guy on the team. So the only thing to say is that, of course, at the time, I wasn't being so chipper about this. Like, now I'm like, ha ha ha, this is where things started getting good. At the time, I was like, this is the lowest point. Like, this is where things start getting really bad. So, another opportunity for me as the player in the moment to have quit the game because I just had, like, no hope for the future. Looking back on it, there was hope that just came later, which is the recurring theme of my sort of experience, my psychological experience with this game. I always felt like I was having less fun than I should have been having, because I didn't know that it was going to turn out to be fun in retrospect, that sort of thing. I was constantly worrying about the future too much. We don't need, like, I've got real life, I've already got real life. Can't in the game it just be like, pop up and say, hey, you're not going to complete the game, start again? Like, can you just tell me? Just tell me. I don't have time to waste on this, guys. I'm too stressed to play Warhammer 40K Mechanicus, or at least that's what I thought when I was playing it. By the end, I was like, well, that was kind of fun, and I'm trying to, like, hammer home to you and myself that I was not having fun, except for those things that I'm never showing in the game that I thought were really fun, the actual turn-based tactics happening, but yes, marred, I guess, by the background thought that all of it was going to be for nothing ultimately, and I would just have to start the game again, and the game's extremely long, and that's a pretty annoying prospect. It's so samey. I don't want to play the beginning again. Well, maybe you know what I mean. I can't remember how I put it towards the beginning. I said something like it's a bad game disguised as a good game, or maybe it was the opposite. Essentially, I think it's a good game with which I was having a bad time. Some of that bad time was the game's fault, and some of it's my fault for picking settings and challenging myself to do something that's too difficult. But at the same time, if the game was better, I don't think I would have had those problems. Like, if it was faster, if it was less annoying to actually play the game, it wouldn't be an issue, like the prospect of having to do a mission again or something, or start the game again, or just exploring the future of the game to see what happens would be better if it was more intuitive and fun and just interesting to play moment to moment. It definitely is more interesting than in the vanilla with our 1.5 speed up boost. It even speeds up all the loading screens and stuff, so it's really useful. Not sure why I haven't been using this on all games, but maybe I will in the future. I don't know, I'm trying to give this really mixed review of Mechanicus, where it's like I can kind of see why this is fun, but both by design and in my specific experience, the fun is being held back from the player, and I think we're both to blame for this, but ultimately I guess it was the developer's responsibility to make me have fun because I gave them money for that purpose. So I don't know, it should be like, hey Devin, why are you playing on Ironman mode as a beginner? That's a bad idea. Like, it could have said that in a tooltip or something like that. Like, this game is too positive feedback loopy to play in Permadeath if you don't know what you're doing, and I probably wouldn't have done it. Well, maybe they don't want to do that because of how easy it's about to get and how it's going to turn out that you actually can play. Even with all the disadvantages I've lumped on myself, I've lost half the stuff you're supposed to be using in the game, and, well, is it even going to be possible to play a game like that? Surely, if it was possible to complete the game with only half of the characters you're supposed to use, that would mean the game is savagely unbalanced, right? Well, I guess it is, so we'd best carry on and see that. With the one extra caveat I'll add here, that I'm not putting this forwards as a complaint. I think I've seen people complaining that the game is ultimately unbalanced. I am not putting that forwards as a complaint because I liked the stuff that was unbalanced. Maybe I'll talk more about that later. One other note to insert here before I forget. From this point on, but not actually for the rest of the campaign, for a bit of the campaign from here, I actually turned the difficulty down. You can change the difficulty mid-campaign. We had it on normal, so it's now on easy, or casual I think it's called. It does actually tell you what that does, which is already very nice for the game. It means the enemy have 25% less health. It also says there are 25% fewer enemies, which I guess probably means like 1 or 2 fewer enemies per mission, something like that. And indeed, the game is much more fast and furious when the enemy have less health, because you're more likely to kill them in one hit, and it's more like you're surfing through the map doing action after action. Because killing enemies gives you a cognition point and allows you to take another action, you can get into a real flow state if the enemies are kind of easy to kill. And I found that very fun, and indeed very easy. So this is building on that thing I said earlier, where the game's fun when it goes well, it's fun when it's easy, that sort of thing. So I played on easy for a while because I was concerned about this solved failure state thing. I thought surely it's now impossible to complete the game from here. But as you'll see, as I became more powerful, at some point I thought this is way too easy and put it back to the settings it was on before. I don't remember when I did that. Maybe I'll actually see it in the footage as I go through and we'll see that. But I'm pretty sure that from here it's on casual for at least a few missions, just so you know. Of course, it's not only the difficulty level that's going to change the difficulty, but the fact I've stumbled upon the Castellan robot, so here I am using it for the first time. It costs loads of cognition to bring this thing into battle, so I can't use it all the time effectively, but after realizing how powerful it is, I'm going to start trying to get it out as much as possible. It has an absolutely gigantic area of effect attack that it can use for no cognition. There are similar attacks that some tech priests and some builds will be able to use, but they'll cost you cognition to do it. The robot can do it for free. It does 5 to 10 damage and then an additional 6 damage over the next couple of turns due to its status effect, which makes it probably the most powerful base damage attack in the entire game without buffs. And you can buff it. And it can do it every single turn, and it has tons of health and some armor as well. And you have an infinite supply of them, and they're pretty cheap to use as well. Just overall, this robot outclasses everything in the game. Its only disadvantage is that it's big and slow, and we'll see that coming into play. And of course that it can't do things like cognition movement, so it's less interesting to use than Tech Priest, and sometimes it's less useful. Well, we saw there a nice Tech Priest attack from ranged Raspberry, clearing basically the whole field in this particular stage in a single hit. Possibly because the enemy's health is lower, it's easier to do cool feeling things like that, and I definitely remember feeling like once I had the enemy health down, I was having more fun just straight up, because you're more likely to achieve something right away. You get like good feedback from what you're doing right away. I've mentioned this before a couple of times, like when I play XCOM, I usually play it on like double damage or something, so that just whatever happens right away. I don't really like damaging enemies and then attacking them again to damage them again. I kind of just want to die in one hit and have the enemy die in one hit as well. I don't know. I remember when I was a child, I used to play Time Splitters 2 and I would always put it on one hit kill mode so that there was just no health mechanics in the game. For some reason, I like it fast and wild in that particular style. And I got a little bit of that in Mechanicus after reducing the enemy health. So here we are planning what to do in the next mission. We tend to plan a way through the map that means we touch the fewest possible text adventures because I didn't really like them. However, I've now enabled something in the settings, and we see it here. Below the text options, there are now icons. This was called something like Enhanced Exploration. I think it was in the difficulty menu. By default it's turned off. You can turn it on with no downside, and what it does is give you a hint at what it's going to do when you pick an option. And while it's just sort of an icon pertaining to what number is going to change, this turns out to be a big hint in practice, because if it's talking about awakening, it almost always means increase awakening, so that means don't click on that one. When it talks about cognition, it almost always means increase cognition, so it means do click on that one. So using that, we're going to disproportionately benefit from these little choices that come up now and again. And as you can see right here, I'm already benefiting from the glyph system by just looking them up. This feels less like cheating than I originally thought, because by about halfway through the game, it's plausible you would have seen them all and been able to write down on a piece of paper and draw the thing for what it does. So when you're in the second half of the game, you could know what they do and already have the advantage I have here by looking at the guide. You would just have to use ink from a pen, and I don't want to, so I'm happy to just look it up on the Steam guide every single time. And also with the glyph system, they're not always good. One thing I thought is that there would always be a correct choice. There can be glyph setups like this one right here, where all the options are bad and you just shouldn't pick anything, and you do have the option to cancel your choice, so that's useful. You saw me there bypassing an optional battle despite talking about how good they were earlier. I'm just trying to get more awakening first so I can go back and then have more reason to do the optional battle for its awakening reducing purposes. Here's me finishing a mission in a cognition friendly way. Another thing I eventually realised is that you should try to finish each stage with the highest amount of cognition banked up as possible, so running to particular points before you shoot the enemy to pick up cognition along the way is a good idea. Just so that as you go into the next mission, you'll have max cognition from the start, allowing you to deploy more stuff or take loads of turns right away. There's me finding out what the weird cloak icon means in the text adventure enhanced exploration system. It means you take damage. It can probably mean something else, but after seeing it once I was like, right, I'll just never click on that option. So we're easily starting to solve my text adventure woes and the fact I didn't really like how I was just seemingly receiving random bonuses or random penalties. Now I'm going to vaguely know what they are in advance and just take a good one, usually cognition as far as I recall. Here we are in that skirmish battle. Now that we've got some awakening to get rid of, we go in and do the battle, because not only are you going to lose the 4 awakening from winning, you'll probably lose some more from destroying consoles along the way, and I think this map has 3 on it, so you can potentially lose 6 more points. So it was worth skipping it at first. We're going to come away from this with essentially no awakening and essentially no damage, because as we saw just there, I tanked all the damage on my robot, spent my tech priest turns repairing the robot, and also you got healed for completing the mission. So we go into the final battle with pretty much no awakening, pretty much full health, and a bit of cognition to spend as well. This is more like it, and as I said, it turns out that once your party is powerful enough, you can do something like this on most missions, so our awakening is going to be not going up very much from here. I actually remember this particular fight, outstanding from other fights, probably because this is the only time I fought on this particular map, but also for this little moment. There was one of those annoying suspicious activity things where I moved out of the deployment zone 2 steps and it spawned 3 more enemies, and I was like, that's so harsh, you can't just do that to me, game. However, I immediately eliminated them because it's ranged raspberry. We killed 2 with our first shot, and now I'm sizing up my options here. I can just fire at the final one. The thing is, when you kill enemies right at the start of a mission, it actually is plausible that enough turns will pass that those enemies will reanimate. So the thing I was talking about earlier, where it's not really worth double tapping the enemies to stop them reanimating. In this case, maybe you should do it, because you probably will end up taking long enough to have these things reanimate. It takes 3 to 2 turns for them to come back, and they come back at half health and just immediately act again. So it is a bother to let them come back. In this case, we can do a thing that kills 2 of them doubly so, and the other one we can finish another time. That's a nice first move. My plan here is to move the entire party from where it spawned at the top of the map to the left side of the map. There's an enemy behind me which I have to ignore, and I remember thinking at some point I'll have to go back and kill that guy, but I was more concerned with the rest of the map. It's a very windy map with open line of sight in the middle. A great opportunity to know how much range the enemy have, essentially. Like, if I knew that the 2 Necron Immortals in the middle couldn't shoot all the way across the walkway I'm considering walking down now, I could do something with that. But because you can never actually find out the range on enemy weapons, other than pure trial and error and trying to gain an instinct for it, I don't know, it feels like you're missing something there. Like, you could make more interesting decisions if it just showed you them, or you could discover them, you could research them, or even by doing something like that, doing the attacks that reveal enemy health might also reveal their attack range, something like that. Instead, we're going to just guess as usual. Later on in the mission, more and more enemies kept spawning. That's another reason I remember this mission, because there were multiple suspicious enemy activity things that came up, spawning more Necrons to kill, and a bunch of them spawned in our spawn zone back at the beginning of the stage, so I had to eventually turn around from going all the way to the bottom and start walking back towards the top. And this was relatively inconvenient, because of course I want to finish this mission while we're still at 0 awakening, and it looked like I was going to do it until this happened, another suspicious activity, and several more enemies spawn, 4 extra, including 2 Immortals, which are the harder version of the regular Necrons to kill. They just have tons of health and tend to be armored as well, so generally speaking, you're going to have to invest a couple of turns to killing them. And that's a bother, so my dream's out the window. Doesn't matter that much, but the thing about this mission is, it's going fine. Like, we're not taking any damage really, like we are killing the enemy, it's more just a bother that there's so many of them to kill. And instead of, say, the 2 Servitors you can see in my party in the bar at the top, you're quote-unquote supposed to have 2 additional tech priests. We're already powerful enough that I'm like, this game's easy. Look, I'm only really complaining about the fact I'm not getting 100% of the best result. I'm only getting 95% of the best result from my combat actions. You're supposed to be significantly more powerful than I am now. So obviously that's where the difficulty menu is supposed to come in. Like, this is the easiest difficulty. It's the king of easy difficulty, back at it again, complaining that the game is easy when you put it on easy mode. The point is, I'm not experiencing so much the power creep that probably comes with the intended experience. And this might be an argument for permadeath. So this is spinning back around now. While I spent most of this video complaining about my choice to go into permadeath, at this stage in the game, when things have suddenly become relatively easy, it makes more sense for me to have lost that stuff earlier, because if I hadn't, we'd be doing really, really well. I mean, we're already almost doing as well as you possibly can in the game. Like, we're getting through missions with minimal damage and with minimal awakening as well. We could do a little bit better, but it would barely make a difference at that stage. And yes, we could be much more powerful if I was playing on the ordinary settings. So I think that's probably what people were complaining about when it comes to the balance, and that's why in the difficulty menu there are so many options for disabling mechanics and making the game harder. The actual original difficulty settings just add more enemies and give them more health, but then there are all the other settings where you can disable cognition movement or disable ranged attacks, disable area of effect damage. Essentially all the things that make the game easy can be switched off, and I'm sure that was added in response to people complaining about the game being easy or getting too easy. Well, here I am, also saying that the game does get easy and potentially that it gets quote-unquote too easy. However, I don't want to frame this as a complaint, as I think I already said. This was when I started having the most fun with the game, because now it's really all about the turn-based tactics. I don't have to sit here thinking about the macro game quite so much. I'm not constantly worrying that I have to finish this stage with full health or I'm going to lose money and then in 5 hours that will become a problem. Now I'm more just thinking about, hey, if I do this, I can do this, and I can finish this stage a turn earlier. Hey, if I fire at this enemy, they might actually die because we've reduced their health, that sort of thing. This opens up more options, and those options are going to be opened up to me now, rather than next turn. I can do the thing I want to do now, so it feels like I'm doing more stuff. You know, the game feel has improved. Right there, a giant robot just immediately drops 2 enemies in the corner. That's going to make life easier. We'll pick up that free cognition point. Lovely javelin. The problem being the robot is now in the corner, and because it has terrible movement range, it's probably just going to have to stand there. Although, because there are also 2 Necron tombs right there, chances are the game is going to want to spawn enemies where the robot is, so it's a bit of an insurance policy to leave somebody standing there as well. But of course we don't want to let the stage go on long enough for the enemy to keep spawning more enemies, because there's a positive feedback loop of the game getting easier and easier the easier you are fighting it. Like, the reward for you being good at the game isn't just that the set challenge goes well, it's that the set challenge is reduced to make it even easier, so you don't even need to be good anymore. That, I guess, is the balancing downside of positive feedback loops. But while this could all be framed as a complaint, I'm trying not to frame it. Like, it's impossible for me to make a comment that doesn't sound like a complaint because I'm from the United Kingdom. However, I was having more fun once the game became completely broken. I just enjoyed using the robot to do everything. I enjoyed the fact that ranged raspberry would just kill like 5 enemies in one hit and it would just completely negate the challenge. Like, you might have seen earlier, there was a mission where the objective was like survive 5 turns, and we just completely killed everybody in the first turn, so you don't have to do the whole survival mechanics. It skips all of the additional spawns and you just quit the mission. You get to go home early, you get to play more of the game in less real life time, you get more content. I was having a great time with the game being broken, and I'm throwing this at the people who I presume were complaining about the game becoming like this. I think it's good that it becomes like this. I think the developers probably didn't need to worry so much about forcing the game to be harder with all of these extra things they tacked on. It's just kind of fun like this now. The last part of this mission proves to be one of these ultra-rare Tech Priests must escape objectives, which, as I said, are the best ones because you can do some shenanigans now, because we still have both of our turns this round, and because with Cognition movement you can theoretically move a very long way as long as there is Cognition on the way. We can escape before the enemy take any turns, essentially. We can just get out of here. Here's me making life hard for myself by randomly attacking this guy on the way. He goes into Overwatch, pointing right at me. That's essentially the same as the thing from XCOM called Overwatch, where they shoot you if you move. Unfortunately, he also teleported to a spot with a little bit of terrain in the way, so there's no line of sight. This allows us to escape immediately with no further action taken, and we'll get away before any mention of line of sight into Overwatch gives us XCOM/Xenonauts flashbacks. So there you go, did another mission with only 1 awakening. That's got to be a good thing if the game was designed for you to always get 3 originally. We should be starting to pull ahead of the curve, or at least catching up from being behind from earlier. Most importantly, we got another priest for that mission, and with this guy, I'm going right down the Secutor class tree. So this is the tree that focuses on supporting your troops. Because now that I have that robot, I thought let's just try and buff up the robot with a dedicated buff guy. And this turns out to be the thing I was talking about before, where I was referencing a more overpowered thing than ranged raspberry that's going to come about. It's going to turn out to be sacrifice here, because buffing troops gives you so much power, and we'll see just why that is in a second. There's one particular overpowered aspect to it that makes it unusually overpowered. So with that, we'll have this guy chasing our robots and healing them, while the rest of the team does the business. Here's an example of using the robot, not really to do damage, but as a distraction. We've got Sacrifice and the robot facing most of the enemies on this map over there, while our other priests are safely somewhere else, shooting down the flanks at the enemy, and here's a great shot that kills most of them, even hitting myself, but that's fine, the robot is here to take damage partially after all. This is another case where I've clearly learned a lesson. I probably wanted to shoot at the 2 downed flayed ones to get the 2 cognition I would get from killing them again, but I could also save my shot, spend some cognition to move around a bit this turn, also kill another enemy, also go and scan that thing off to the left. Essentially, you need to not worry about hitting the downed ones, as I said, just do more stuff, just keep completing the mission, and you'll probably complete it before all of the downed ones get back up, and that was almost always the case in my experience, so it's worth ignoring them and just hoping you'll somehow complete the mission in like 2 turns, because you probably somehow will, even if you don't really see the path to doing so right away. So for example, this is the same turn as before, we're still killing the enemy, we don't give them a chance to move, we escape before the round ends, and most importantly we escape before any tombs open up, spawning new enemies to extend the mission, and the positive feedback loop gets going. So once again, by playing well, you don't have to play as well, making the game generally easier. Here's a decision where I could do something where it's like a foot icon, which means it's something to do with enemy initiative. But, well, it's hard to know which one it's going to be. If we just go with the Cognition option, it's almost always you just get Cognition, and that's always useful. It might even be the most useful thing. So with that enhanced exploration mode thing enabled, we're just laughing every time the text adventures come. They start to be always good, or almost always good. A couple of times they still surprise me. This mission went so well, we completed it not only at 0 awakening, but at 0.0 awakening, not even close to getting 1 awakening point. There's no advantage for being that good, but it just looks good. We're doing extremely well with the addition of sacrifice to the team as well. We were doing fine with just 2 priests. 3 priests seems to be enough, at least for casual difficulty, to absolutely dominate, and it did pretty well on normal as well. Well, we'll be back to normal soon enough. Maybe we'll see when that happens. I think it's still on casual here. The other thing we got for doing that mission is loads of Blackstone, and it's time for us to spend it. We also, by the way, unlocked another troop type, which we'll see later, which is like something that's a bit worse than the giant robot. So we unlocked the units not in the sort of correct order, I guess, somehow. There is a random element to what you get for doing missions, so I guess that's to be expected. Anyway, the point I wanted to make is, you can see me here going right down the secutor tree, and for low-level tech priests, if you can get together like 1,000 Blackstone, you can just buy everything from one tree right away. So with that, we go to max rank for Secutor. This gives you the Reinforce skill, and perhaps you already know if you've played the game why that's so useful to us. It's going to be very useful, and we'll see it in action right here in the next mission. Here I am, casually walking around, just collecting Blackstone, and you'll see I use a canticle here to boost up my Cognition points. The reason is, my sacrifice turn is about to come about, and I'm thinking, I want to use this Reinforce skill to call down one of my giant robots, and they usually cost 5 Cognition, I think it is. So that's why I needed to have max Cognition as this guy's turn came up. We've achieved that. However, we didn't need to. We can deploy the robot anywhere on the map. That's the first thing this skill does. You pay 1 Cognition to make a deployment during your tech priest's turn rather than in the between round segments where you're normally meant to deploy things. And you can deploy anywhere. Normally you can only deploy within a few tiles of where your tech priests are standing. So this alone is really powerful because of course we can just put our guy behind the enemy lines, make them turn around, be a distraction. That's going to absorb so much attention, so much damage from the tech priests that this just pays for itself. A really powerful move. However, you might also have noted, we did not pay the Cognition cost for deployment. So the reason that the Castellan robot costs 5 Cognition is because it's so powerful that it needs to take away 5 moves from your tech priests to make up for it. But what if it didn't? What if you just got the robot? And what if you could theoretically put this skill on every character and keep making robots? You could make several robots during the first turn. This is where the true outrageously overpowered aspect comes in. Because 1 robot is often enough to deal with a sector of the map. It probably kills enemies in 1 to 2 hits, as evidenced right here, and it doesn't spend any Cognition to make its attacks. And because we only spent 1 Cognition to bring this thing in, well, the value is just out of control. We spent a total of 1 Cognition to kill 2 enemies, which is worth 2 Cognition to us right away, and to have a distraction somewhere on the map, and for that distraction to have tons of health and armor, and the robot can even use a special ability that increases its own armor. So you can just dump it somewhere in the middle of the enemy, tell it to armor up and stand there, because that will just draw fire away from everything else. And as I think I said, you have an infinite supply of these robots. Not on every mission, you pick how many to bring, so you could bring 1 to 3 per mission. But you can just get another one once you're back on the ship and keep bringing them to the next mission, which, well, you can't do that with tech priests, as we've been learning. So essentially, it's a combination of no consequences for them receiving damage, they're big and armoured so they're likely to receive damage and block enemy lines of sight and draw their attention. They are extremely powerful as a combat unit. They're perhaps not as powerful as a really powerful tech priest build, but they're more powerful than most builds, and they're more powerful than all of the other units you can get. And now, we can put them not only anywhere on the map in the first turn, but we can do it for free. The rest of the game is just going to be me doing that, and doing it more and more, every single mission, and it always works really well. So the game is now officially broken, we'll be fine from here. Here's a look at what happened when I took my new strategy into the next boss. It happens to be the exact thing that breaks this boss especially, because in this one, the map is a spiral, and the gimmick is you're supposed to walk up around the spiral towards the boss who's out of your line of sight at the top. Of course, by spawning a giant robot at the top, we skip that part already, so we can set the boss on fire in the first turn. The only possible downside is that being up here might aggro the boss early and make them do something, that sort of thing. It doesn't matter though, because here's the real boon. The gimmick of the stage even further turns out to be that as you walk up around this spiral, some flayed ones will spawn, and as you kill them, it increases the boss's HP. So it just so happens that the best way to do this fight is without progressing through the map, so you need to be able to get units up there without moving them up there. So being able to spawn a unit of your choosing, and one of the best units in the game, right next to the boss, turns out to be very, very useful. And yes, the robot is well able to solo the boss, so everyone else kind of stays down near the spawn area. I'm using a shield there to just deflect enemy attacks worthy to come in, but they don't, because we obliterate that boss. That was pretty good, and it was after this that I finally caught on camera me changing the difficulty settings. So it must have been that boss went so well, I was so outraged, I was like, right, we have to get back out of easy now because it's just stupid. So at least we're now back to where we were before on the difficulty scale. Let's see how it does on normal with more enemies and them having more health. Some nice upgrades to grab there, extra cognition and a deployment slot, let's go get them. In this mission, I'm using the other unit I unlocked, the Battle Servitor. So this is the penultimate unit in the tree, I guess you could say. It's a bit worse than the Battle Robot. It does though have an interesting attack. It's got area of effect damage that completely ignores terrain. So you can shoot through walls and all sorts of things with this attack. Well, not shoot through walls, the area of effect goes through walls for whatever reason. Which in that case was a bad thing, because I couldn't attack the enemy, since it would also hit me. And what you really need for that unit to be truly useful is attack ground. It doesn't have any abilities other than firing that unit, so it would be nice to give it also attack ground, so you can essentially target the correct location to hit the area that you need. Because I did find that in practice, you very commonly hit something you didn't want to hit because its area of effect is so large, and it does so much damage that that's a big problem. Essentially, it's too good, it's out of control, and the other robot is just more in your control and is also a bit better. So I didn't really like that unit. Well anyway, things went well, we got some more cash, and what I'm doing with the cash is I'm now trying to get a second max rank Secutor class person, and that's where Shooting Sherry comes in here. It's difficult because I've already got all sorts of other upgrades, and the cost of getting an upgrade goes up and up. So it's now very expensive for me to suddenly start going down a new class and seek to max it out. But if I can do that, then I'll be able to use the reinforce command twice at the start of every mission, which will be out of control, so that's what I was going for. Here's me using the battle robot to obliterate one of the more powerful enemies in the game. I can't remember what they're called, might have been a destroyer or something, this big guy who, like your battle robot, takes up 4 spaces and blocks your movement. In this case, because it has no physical armor, it's extra weak against the battle robot's attacks, and down it goes. This turned out to be another one of those nice missions, where it's an escape instead of a kill everything mission. So during the same turn I can spend loads of cognition to run somebody all the way from our spawn point near the top left to the place where we have to scan some things for the objective, and then it says, right, go back. We can't do the full cheeky maneuver where we also escape during this turn because some people have already taken their turn this round. So we do it in a more slow way, and that's also quite interesting because you want to see, can I kill any enemies on the way back? Because I believe you still get the resources for killing enemies even if it's an escape the map mission. And sometimes, escaping in a certain way will allow you to take a few shots along the way and take out an extra enemy and get like an extra 20 Blackstone or something. Doesn't matter that much, but it's still fun, and that's my overall review of like all the stuff as usual that I'm not showing you. There are tons of fun little micro decisions that probably aren't worth talking about, but I think were quite good. Here was a case where we fight on a map that's absolutely tiny. It's just this little corridor, essentially. And that means once it says, well, it's now another escape mission, it's hard for me to escape, because we've got the battle servitor, for example, blocking half the tiles, and if people's turns don't come in the right order, I can't move people out of the way in such a fashion that I can easily escape, so we're kind of clogged up here. The game was flashing the delayed turn button at me there. I didn't notice when I was playing, but in the footage, it seemed that if delaying your turn is a really good idea, it flashes at you, because it was a good idea in that circumstance. The delayed turn thing just makes you go last in your turn order if you want to wait until later. Now and again that's useful, such as right there, because my guy would have taken a melee attack if I tried to move and then shoot, which is all I could do with that guy. Maybe the developers have cleverly programmed it such that delaying your turn is made more obvious to you if it's perhaps a useful idea. Although I strongly suspect it's only if it's the only thing you can do that it will start flashing, like if all of your other moves have got cooldowns or something, so it's more likely to happen on a troop that doesn't have any available moves. I thought maybe something clever was happening. Probably not. But you know what, it also doesn't matter. We eventually escaped that situation, probably. Here's another mission where I remember being annoyed, because you see the objective was survive one round at the moment. It was counting down, we just had to survive rounds in this little area. But all it was doing is counting down to some more enemies show up, and then it's a kill all enemies mission. And it's just a tease, because this is what every mission is like. Normally, you just kill all enemies, and during the mission, more enemies show up, so you keep killing more enemies. When the battle objective says something else, you kind of hope that maybe it's going somewhere else with it. Like, if it was a survive X rounds mission, it could be that there are just loads of enemies, and it's more about thinking like, where can I get out of line of sight and just not die for a couple of turns, so it's a little bit different. But it will still turn out to be just kill them. Speaking of kill them, there's me killing myself with a battle servitor. More trouble with its area of effect damage, but it was worth it in that case. We killed 2 enemies, including a Necron Lord, a rarer, more powerful enemy. But yes, those battle servitors proved to be a liability a lot of the time. Doesn't matter too much, because of course when they die, you can just get another one. Here's a look at the costs of units. It does cost more to bring these big units, but it doesn't cost much more. It's not even double the cost of bringing a regular ranged soldier. And they are significantly better. And interestingly, there's this implied mechanic where the only reason we can only take like 6 people or 8 people into combat is because we don't have many seats in our shuttle that we go down on, and we only have one shuttle. Just the old classic like reason why there's a limit on your player party size that always seems to happen in turn-based tactics games. But in this one, if you take the battle robot, it only needs 1 chair in the thing, so that's handy. Because it's like 4 spaces wide, you could have it take up 4 spaces in the thing to make it less overpowered. Instead, we can bring down like 3 or 4 ultimately giant robot things, and later on we'll be able to use all of them as well. The mission I was going to is this boss, and if you remember from way back in this video, in the tutorial, this is the boss it asks you to kill, so it's the exact same mission. It's not actually any harder. The tutorial did hit you with the full-on like late game mission. But this time, we have more stuff. In particular, we're going to call in some reinforcements. First, I checked out what armor the boss had, and seeing that it has physical armor, so it's strong against our main battle robots, we'll bring in a battle servitor to fire at it, picking a spot where it probably won't hit itself and still has a gap to the side that would allow me to run past it if I want to close into melee with a tech priest, something like that. I also just there used a command fire. This allows you to target your soldiers onto enemies that your tech priests can see during a tech priest's turn. And then you also get to take the soldier's turn as well. So basically it allows you to fire twice during the same turn. And since these soldiers have very powerful attacks, that's a very powerful move, a very nice use of 1 cognition to do like an extra 5 to 10 damage. I also throw in a battle robot at the back, and the reason I can do that is that Shoot and Sherry now also has the reinforced command, so we've now reached the era when I can bring 2 battle robots for free, well not for free, for 1 cognition at the start, but you don't pay the usual deployment cost, you just pay for the picking where to deploy it thing, which is what I consider the 1 cognition to be for. Here we're going to buff up our troops in order to use a command fire to finish off the enemy boss. Noting that we didn't even use the giant robot that I deployed, and noting The boss didn't even get its first turn. It went even better than that other boss. Things remain out of control, so increasing the difficulty level hasn't made a huge difference. Here's the weakness of command fire. For whatever reason, command fire doesn't apply area of effect even on attacks that have area of effect, and it still does the animation, like implying it should have area of effect. So there, our flamethrower attack didn't hit the two enemies in front of the target. That's a shame, although there are also plenty of cases where you don't want the area of effect damage, such as with the Battle Servitor if it's in amongst your units. The command fire could be a useful way to get damage out of the unit without automatically killing yourself or something like that. Perhaps in an ideal world, there would be two kinds, or maybe there's another command fire that costs 2 cognition or something that also uses area of effect, when you want to get really cheeky. Here's me doing a mission where we're making good use of the fact that the battle robot can be a distraction and just a thing for the enemies to focus on. We were on this map where you couldn't move very well. There were lots of missing bridges and some of those yellow gates as well, so I was kind of stuck in my deployment zone, but what I could do is send a robot forwards to fight the enemy here in the middle of the map. There I took an opportunity attack to escape melee range, to try and get into melee with this ranged Necron, but it then walks away from me. Maybe I was expecting to also get an opportunity attack on it to make it worth taking the opportunity attack from the other guy. Who knows? Well, as you saw there, we actually lost a robot. That's going to cost me 22 Blackstone. By the way, if the robots don't die, you get 18 Blackstone back. So it's kind of like they cost 22 Blackstone to lose and 4 to use. And realistically, if you take like 2 fewer damage points for having brought one of the robots, which almost certainly will be the case, it will pay for itself, and most probably you'll also get an extra Blackstone pickup from finding a console or something earlier on in a mission because things are going so well because of the giant robot being on your side, and it will totally pay for itself and make a profit. So the higher cost of the units shouldn't be any reason not to bring them. You'll definitely make more than that amount back in practice. So things went well in that mission in the end, because I didn't have to leave my deployment zone, we just fired from it at the enemies and the robots did the rest. And the one thing I wanted to say, as we just sort of plow through all of these missions, is that I remember this being the part of the game that I really liked. Not just because it's now easy, as I mentioned before, like now things are going well, it's fun. There is an aspect of that. But also, when you can summon units, and I always did, there's just more to do, there's more to think about when you have like 5 or 6 units instead of 2 or 3, which is how I was playing much of the game. So now that there's more combos to do effectively and more like, oh, I'll do this in 2 turns time because it's also still going to be my turn in 2 turns, that sort of thing. There's just more to think about, and it's more interesting to me to constantly be acting yourself. This is a somewhat regular point I seem to bring up. Like, I like being in control of the games, so I don't like it when the enemy get turns. Like, it's a very odd thing to say about a game that's kind of about that, but I still think it's worth criticizing anyway. Maybe there's some way to get around this situation. The enemy turns need to be as quick as possible, and you need to absolutely minimize the extent to which I'm not in control of the stuff, because I want to feel like I'm playing a game. I don't know, I'm like an action gamer stuck in a turn-based tactics gamers YouTube channel or something. I'm like, wait a second, this isn't Dark Souls. Why don't all my inputs all the time do something? Because that's what real life's like. Like, that's the extent to which my brain can operate. Like, I could be thinking of things to do all the time. Why do you make me stop? And as I mentioned before, this is a bad game for that, because the enemy animations take a long time. The best thing a developer hearing this can do is just say, well, then you're playing the wrong game effectively. Like, this is what these games are like. Or at least that's what I would have said until recently. Even earlier in this video, I was second guessing my desire to have the slowness removed, thinking, would it lose something? Well, here's me in the future from earlier in this video. Now I think it definitely wouldn't lose something. The reason being that I played a different turn-based tactics game that actually had everything I wanted in terms of these weird design requests, and I was like, oh my god, it is good. I was right. Like, I felt very vindicated after that. I'll probably put that on this channel at some point, so I won't spoil what it is. Coming soon, a turn-based tactics game commentary that does all of the things that I wanted and I've been stupidly ranting about in this video. But I feel less stupid now because I'm like, yes, Mechanicus really is worse for not doing all of these little nitpicky things that I felt sort of annoying to be commenting on. Now I'm like, no, it was fine. So, not only should you play Mechanicus with the speed hacks enabled, like, definitely, it's already way better, the developers should also enable things like animation skipping or having animations be synchronous, like multiple things happening at the same time, so that there are fewer delays, fewer waits, and fewer times when the player isn't in control, especially fewer times when the UI disappears. That was something that sort of really got to me over time, like, stop taking away the UI, because those are my controls. Stop, like, taking my shoes off while I'm walking down the street, that sort of thing. Now I'd like to move on even more swiftly. There's another mission we won without getting any awakening, and looks like I didn't take any damage either. And there's another one. It's kind of hard to tell that I'm cutting between these things because they look the same, but here's one where we got a new tech priest and a level up for our Castellan battle robot, which gives it an extra move, which we'll see in a bit. But most importantly, the new tech priest. What am I going to do with this guy? Well, you probably know. We're going to instantly start going down that tree so that we can have a third summoner class character for all intents and purposes, so that we can have even more overpowered units even earlier in the stage. And, well, obviously if things were going well before, they're going to start getting better and better. There's, well, one Castellan robot doing the business for us. You could have 3 at this stage if you wanted, or if I wanted, and I do want. That's another mission completed, with 0 awakening, no damage taken. And this is why people were probably complaining that it gets easy or something, and were saying, well, disable area of effect weapons so you can't do this. I don't know, I liked it like this. I'm cutting out all of these missions, of course, but I liked all of the stuff that happened in between the comments I'm making here. So you have to imagine that the game is better than I'm making it look. But that, of course, only makes it more of a shame that all of the stuff I don't like is still here, because it stops me from ever wanting to play this game again, for example, even though it's packed with fun moments. We fly into every mission now with 3 robots loaded and a couple of other troops as well, because we've unlocked more space in the Thing. I never fully unlocked the space for the Thing, but in theory, you could bring 4 tech priests and like 6 robots, so even if they die, you could just be like, well, I'll just summon another one. Hopefully it takes long enough to die that the cooldown on the reinforce has run out and you can just instantly replace it. One could imagine this being an effective way to play Mechanicus. What I'm doing is spamming missions in the yellow zone because I wanted to unlock the boss for this area. And our summoning strategy is particularly useful in this zone because it's the place where the energy gates often stop you advancing for a turn. Once you summon stuff on the other side of the gates, that becomes less of an issue. Here was a really cool mission. This is the one fight I remembered more than any other. For a simple reason, it actually does link in with the plot, unlike, say, the final boss and things like that. Because in this mission, the text that was aside the mission was saying, we're exploring this area looking for a library. And once you find the library, there are loads of cognition things everywhere. And that, like, makes sense, right? It's actually something to do with what's supposed to be happening in the game. It's actually changing the way I played the stage, slightly anyway. Essentially, it lets you run to the back of the stage instantly for free. And there we meet up with all the robots I summoned at the back of the stage and start using the close proximity troop supporting abilities, like command fire as we saw and buffing stuff up. Back at the spawn point, we do have to fight a Necron Lord who's right there. However, we have a ranger, and the ranger has an ability to disable an enemy for a turn. So we just disable the enemy in the spawn point and then carry on our way, because realistically, we're probably going to win this stage within the next turn because we're going to end up taking so many actions. So disabling the enemy for one turn has basically killed them for all intents and purposes. So now it's time to start doing some business. That's 3 enemies taken out instantly with our first robot attack, and that's about half the stuff the enemy have. So obviously things are already going a little bit too well, and we haven't even really got started. Here's the extra move that was unlocked on our robots, the melee protocol. It allows them to do a charging attack that immobilizes enemies. That's not that useful because a lot of enemies have a ranged attack, so forcing them to not move isn't as good as forcing them to not take a turn, for example, but it's still handy. It's even handy because the melee range, or melee protocol's range, is quite long. It's about as long as the thing's movement range, and it stacks on top of it. So if you move the full extent during your turn and then do a melee protocol, you effectively get to move again, starting to overcome one of the big weaknesses of these robots, that they can't move very far and can't do cognition movement strats. So here, for example, we do that burn attack, which gets the enemy on the floor out of the way, clearing the path for us to advance and hit the same enemy over there again. This doesn't actually do any damage, even though it looks like it probably should, but because you've closed to melee range, you can now use your melee attack and do some damage that way. Plus we put a burn on this thing, so it will now take damage over time. That guy's mostly dead, and the point is, our robots are more useful than they were before, and before I was going wild about how useful they were, and they actually get even more powerful, as we'll soon see. We end up finishing that mission. We don't avoid awakening this time because there weren't enough consoles to kill, but as you can see, we took minimal damage, killed tons of stuff, and awakening isn't really an issue at this stage because we've done so many missions. There is a finite supply of missions, and we've kind of done most of them. So to continue on, even if we just did badly, we'd probably still make it within the time limit, and the time limit turns out to be not that important. Well, only because of this awakening thing, because I'm skipping over the intended time limit mechanics here. Another case where it's like, this mechanic isn't that bad because I did a thing that disabled the mechanic. It's like, okay, well that means the mechanic is bad because you chose to play without it, that sort of thing. That's the kind of argument I've seen here and there, and I always think like it's a bit of a cop-out. A defense of a mechanic in a game where you say the reason it's not bad is because you can avoid it or because you can disable it in some way. And it's like, well, you wanted to do that, didn't you? So theoretically, the developers there had the potential to make something you would have liked more from the beginning. I don't know if I'm thinking of a specific example here, but that's just a topic, a random trend I've noticed, I guess, in my complaints career as a person who makes and reads complaints on the regular. Many of my complaints are completely invalid, or are they more valid? I've already forgotten what I'm talking about. Well, that's right, my compliments don't count, that's what I'm saying. I'm actually doubling down on the complaints, I think. Many of the things I think are good are actually things the developers should have worked on more anyway, so I didn't have to do any work to make them good for me. I think that's what I'm saying. Now, what are we doing here? We have unlocked the yellow area boss, and it's another gimmick stage where it's just a long corridor filled with these energy gates. It's essentially that place from Star Wars The Phantom Menace. They've got one of those in this Necron tomb. I wonder what function it serves within the tomb and what function it serves within Star Wars The Phantom Menace, for that matter. Well, again, you can probably guess what I'm going to do here. It's a stage where you probably slowly advance, fighting enemies and getting trapped in each section as the gates open and close, like making your way towards the final area. Or you can use Reinforce to bring down 3 troops at the end of the stage and have them just fight the boss for you, while your characters do, well, whatever they want. It doesn't matter at this stage. They can't come over here to help because of the gates, so skipping their turn is a pretty valid option. Our troops will do the business. Here's another thing the robot has unlocked. Now that it's level 3, because another mission gave me that reward somewhere recently, we now not only have more health on the robot, which is already outrageous because it having high health was already one of the things that's so good about it. It has this extra flamethrower attack that shoots in all directions and does less damage. Obviously, it shooting in all directions means you're more likely to hit yourself with it, but still, pretty handy. This boss has good physical armor, so flame attacks aren't that good. That's why I also have our Battle Servitor and a Ranger over there doing energy damage. Here the guys mocking our vessels of flesh, so primitive, so fragile, dies, because he also had the burn status on him, meaning he takes 2 damage whenever it's his turn. So yes, he just about got off his monologue about how weak we were as he died. That was quite enjoyable, and again we kind of skipped the boss because the boss relied on you having to move through a stage. Something that lets you summon your troops at the end of the stage kind of kills that idea. So we've done it again. Now I just have to do stages in the green area, or the second green area. There were 2 green areas, because while the final boss is unlocked, we can go and fight it. It was saying there we also have to fight some other guy, the lord of this sector, and through that we can infer we're supposed to do this sector a bit first to kill that guy outside of the final boss battle, and then go into the final boss. One thing I wanted to randomly add here is that I was thinking, Well, I guess I don't understand what the whole deal with the Necrons is. What's the deal with the Necrons? And well, there's 2 points to make about that. The first is that the game could potentially go more into what the deal with the Necrons is, because this is a game that presumes your knowledge of Warhammer lore. Like, luckily I did have it, so it's not that much of a problem. But it never talks about what the Necrons are, or where we are, or what's going on in general. We're just kind of here doing some turn-based tactics. I think there's a context, and I don't remember what it is. But the thing I wanted to know specifically about the Necrons is, if they're immortal, what are we even doing? Like, I guess I don't understand like what our angle on fighting these battles is. Are we looking for something in the tomb? Because we never find it in the game if that's what we're doing. And it's like, well, the objective of the game in the meta sense is to kill the bosses, but what does it mean to kill a boss when they're immortal? Like, they'll just come back. They'll just be another thing that's exactly the same tomorrow. So I don't understand what we're doing in the broad sense, or like what's going on. This is true in real life and in the game, so it's just doubling down. What does it mean to defeat the Necrons? Beings that when you kill them, they don't die, they teleport away, going into reanimation chambers, and from there they reappear. So this would imply the main goal of the game should be to destroy their coffins, or to destroy the tomb, like to physically break the machines that reanimate the Necron soldiers. That's how you defeat them. You never do this, and I don't know if our characters think about this, or if our characters even know about the Necrons. Like, do they know that the Necrons can regenerate using these machines infinitely? I'm not sure. Even I'm not sure if that is true. Our characters think they can win these fights, and they think there's a reason to constantly go into the tomb and do something. I guess what we're trying to quote-unquote do is stop the quote-unquote awakening of the Necrons, because more and more of them are waking up and eventually they might invade a planet or something. But we don't have any idea how to do it, and the thing we do that completes the game doesn't achieve our objective, and we would have no reason to believe that it would either. So it's very confusing. As the great philosopher Lil Jon once said, what? And I think there's a lot of room for explaining what's going on here, because there is so much plot in the game that I've been cutting out entirely because it doesn't matter. Some of it should talk about what's going on, and we should perhaps learn how to kill the Necrons and have the game change because of it. That would be ideal. Like if we moved from fighting their soldiers to primarily fighting their sarcophagi, like the sort of green misty things you see up against the wall in various stages. Maybe that would make sense or something, and you'd get more permanent rewards for defeating their infrastructure. We need to destroy this building we're inside. It's the building that's the problem. Walking around killing infinitely regenerating skeleton guys doesn't do anything as far as I know in Warhammer lore, but the point is also that I don't really know. I probably should, since I'm this deep into this game that's had so many opportunities to tell me what's going on, and is a game that is indeed thematically about learning things about the world. That's what the Mechanicus are kind of like in the lore. They're the guys who aren't just completely like stomped upon by the Emperor and his friends and such. Like, everyone in the Warhammer world is just very subservient and hive-minded, essentially, to serve the Emperor for the good of humanity and exterminating the Xenos, that sort of thing. But the Mechanicus feel like they're a bit different. They're kind of a bit more normal in that they're more scientific, so they're more like us in the real world. I don't know. Maybe they should work out real ways to defeat the Necrons and do it, and this would be a gameplay activity of some kind. Well, do you really need gameplay activities when I can just constantly spawn more and more robots right in front of the enemy, like right here? Another thing I actually didn't mention is that when you spawn a unit, it virtually always goes right after your turn, so it's basically you taking your turn to use the robot's attack, making your turn very powerful. But this isn't always the case, and that's another thing I never really understood throughout the game. There's some sort of system for determining the turn order and when a newly spawned unit will go in the turn order, where sometimes a couple of enemies will go before your troop does, but usually not. There's probably like a hidden initiative stat or something on every individual unit to determine their turn order, giving me Xenonauts flashbacks where there were like 2 or 3 hidden stats determining things like that. Stop the flashbacks, stop not understanding what the Necrons are, stop questioning why we're killing them if they're immortal. Let's just do it, because It's fun to work out ways to kill them in as few turns as possible. That's the ultimate plot reason for all of Mechanicus happening. The Mechanicus as an organization thought it would be quite fun to just kill endlessly respawning enemies so that the game never finishes. That'll take a while, that'll waste some time. Let's do that for a bit. Now what we're going to do is cut to the end. Something, it's the final boss. Essentially, I didn't find the actual boss of the green area, and I decided to try the final stage just to see what it was going to be. And it turns out, we have to fight the guy I was looking for. He was here all along. I suppose if you don't fight all of the bosses, you fight them all now, but because there's only one in here, he's just sort of in the corner, and the rest of the areas on the map are empty. So, we have to kill this guy. He's on his own with no support. He does have lots of armor. However, he also comes with a built-in, really easy to exploit weakness. There are these various things on the map, and if you kill them, it does 10 damage to the boss. He has something like 30 health, and 2 of the things are in your deployment zone, so combined with us spawning robots at the other end of the map, we've got loads of chances to hit those things. And probably, if there were more bosses, you'd need to kill more of them to kill more of the bosses. We don't though. We can use the robots to essentially zone the boss into his spawn zone so he can't do anything because he had a melee attack, I think, so we'll just keep him busy while we do the business back here. We've already killed one of the ones near the spawn zone, there's the other one. With that, the boss dies unceremoniously, which is how all of the bosses have been dying recently, so that makes sense. We probably missed out on some other gimmick stage where you could kill that thing in a different way that in practice would have been quite similar, I expect. Well anyway, all of this leads to what we were apparently trying to do. We found the Necron Overlord. And again, our characters aren't that excited by this prospect. I'm not going to say it's the first time he was mentioned in the plot, like when he shows up. He might have been mentioned earlier, but I don't know. Again, I think it should be made more important in the plot because it is in the game, so our characters not reacting to this happening is a ludonarrative dissonance. Well anyway, this guy has 99 health, as you can see, absolutely loads, but he has no armor, so you can just wail on him with everything. He does get 2 turns in a row though, so he's effectively 2 units. And as you saw, he has another one of these infinite range melee attacks where he teleports to the melee target. There I was strategically not putting a robot where he was, thinking he's probably going to teleport again, and indeed he did, teleporting right back to the start of the map and killing one of my guys, almost killing another. Pretty nasty. And also, because this guy is a melee unit, it means our battle servitor, which I have deployed, isn't going to be very useful because we'll probably hit ourselves if we fire at the boss. And of course, the big robots are even less useful because the boss has teleported to very far away. It's multiple turns of movement to bring these things into range. And well, by the time we get there, he can just teleport away again. So we've finally actually encountered a situation where spamming loads of giant robots isn't the answer. We've got 4 of them on the field, and they're not really doing us any good right now. But the Humble Ranger is going to be useful because I can use that move I mentioned earlier where it disables the enemy for a turn. Because the boss gets double turns, he's still going to take a turn, but will only be able to do 1 attack instead of 2, and that's important because his attacks are deadly enough that they'll probably kill you in 2 hits, so forcing him to only do 1 attack means more characters alive. In this case, for whatever reason, he's really focusing down the foot soldiers, who of course we have an infinite supply of. Perhaps the final boss should try and kill your characters so they die heroically, especially because at this stage in the game, it doesn't actually matter if they die, so you could have a heroic final battle and it wouldn't be a problem in terms of balancing the game. Well, as you can see, we just fired everything at him because we had like 10 turns in a row before his next turn, and it killed him, so it wasn't that bad. The final boss was marginally harder than the other bosses, however he wasn't harder than, say, 2 normal enemies, or 2 decent normal enemies, where they'll probably do more damage to you or pose more of a threat or have more special abilities or something. Like that huge health bar proved to be not important, just because when you take 10 turns and everybody's overpowered, you actually can do like 50 damage per turn to a single target. Anyway, after this, our people are like, yes, we've killed the guy. One of the characters is like, won't there just be another one? Kind of saying the thing that I was trying to say earlier. And the main character says, enough, our work is done. So it almost actually breached the surface, the complaint I'm making here. The characters are perhaps aware that what they have done doesn't constitute defeating the Necrons. However, if we say that it does, maybe that's good enough. So we've captured this guy. I'm not sure why he didn't teleport away this time, but maybe that's a significant thing. He was the enemy's strategist, so the rest of the Necrons on this planet become stupid. That's effectively the ending. Like, someone else can probably deal with them now because now they're dumb. And we fly away. And it heavily implies that this is like the bad ending to some extent, because in the achievements that I was checking out, there are 2 achievements for getting certain endings. You can side with one of your 2 tech priest assistants, the techie one or the religious one, to get different endings. So maybe there's one where you integrate Necron technology into your own and you advance, and there's another one where you exterminate the planet and we don't have to worry about the heresy of the Necrons. We got the nothing ending, where we kind of did a thing, we decided that that was enough, and we left. And maybe someone else will come and keep killing the Necrons, I don't know, a very inconclusive ending, and it's probably some kind of bad ending, because I didn't do all of the regular missions. I'm guessing you have to do enough of them to unlock the real endings. Well, the point is, the game's over with very little fanfare, and I suppose it just ends the way that it begins and carries on for the entire time. It's extremely formulaic, it's just sort of stuff happening. You're probably not supposed to think about any of the narrative consequences or what have you. And while I'm saying it's formulaic, once again it's an off-ED complaint that's actually not a complaint moment, because the formula upon which this formulaic process is based is a good formula. So all I can do is repeat the final point that I've made a few times throughout the video, which is that I actually think the core gameplay is good. I like the turn-based tactics. What I don't like is the presentation of the turn-based tactics. That is to say, the animations are too long, they need to be synced up more and stuff. We essentially need a quality of life improvement, and the only frustrating thing is, well, back what I said way earlier, there are other games that get this right. There were games getting this right long before Mechanicus came out, and it seems to be a genre convention to get it wrong. And I don't know what we're supposed to do about this. Like, I'm stuck in the past. I'm stuck in a parallel universe where the idea that there should be input lag has become popularized, and now we just have to deal with it for some reason. You just have to keep stopping. I don't know, maybe I'm just too ADHD-ish to play a turn-based tactics game, but it feels like anyone would benefit from at least having the option to skip over things. That's the secret to all game design conundrums, of course. You just make it an option. It's a really artistic move to force something that at least some players won't like into the game, so you can force players to have to wait for the movement animations to end before you can start looking at the UI for what you're going to do after the move. But you have to be like, as a director of the game, as the developer, you have to say, there's some kind of real effect that I'm trying to imprint upon the players by making them wait. This has to be thematic in some way. It has to do something in terms of the game experience for them to constantly lose the UI for a bit, and then they get it back, and then they can see what they're doing. I don't know. It's a real mixed bag, basically, Mechanicus. That's going to be my final comment on the game. I thought the presentation in terms of the story and the idea and the sound is good. I liked what I was seeing, but I didn't like what I was feeling in terms of the game feel. I didn't necessarily like what I was playing all the time, so it was flashes of interesting moments that are mired in the fact that you're sort of stopping constantly to do nothing, and you don't really need to. The thought process in the turn-based tactics is faster than you can input commands, so you find yourself waiting for very short periods of time quite often. And by the way, once again, the reason I keep saying this throughout the video, and I keep making the same point over and over, is to be annoying. Whenever a game has an annoying mechanic, I like to talk about it in an annoying way, just to somehow get across my point. I don't know if this works, but I enjoy doing it anyway. If you're annoyed by the fact that I'm constantly stopping making good points to make the same bad point over and over again, well, there you go. Now you've got the Mechanicus experience in watching this video form. This is either the worst or the best Mechanicus commentary that has ever been made. And the other thing to mention, of course, is the speed-up aspect that really made the game a lot better for me. And seeing it like this, it's the classic you can't go back thing. we're watching this footage here. This is 50% faster than it's supposed to be, but looking at it, you might think, it's a bit slow. They could probably speed this up, like, why do you have to wait for the character to move and then the UI disappears, they pick up the thing here. UI might come back in a bit and we can start inputting our next order. We don't really need to do that because these are just inevitable things that the player should have the option to skip over and to permanently switch off as well, but it's not there. And yes, you'd, looking at this, not really think that this is significantly faster than it's supposed to be. And I think that's a problem for the base game. Like, the thing I wanted to say is that right back at the beginning, this game pushed me away. It had the strong potential of becoming a game that I occasionally cover on this channel, where I play the beginning and then just talk about why I didn't play the rest. I had plenty of material for that video after the first 1 or 2 sessions playing it. But because of its interesting turn-based tactics mechanics, I pushed on. A counterexample would be Into the Breach, which I really liked. I liked it even more, but I actually stopped playing towards the beginning of my experience because I was like, well, this game isn't rewarding enough or something to keep playing it, even though its mechanics are extremely good. Here I thought, yeah, I'm enjoying the mechanics, I want some more of them. And of course, because it has a sort of plot, it compels you to vaguely play towards the end, although of course, in practice, the plot is almost completely irrelevant. It factors into like 1 or 2 missions in the game, I don't know, like it barely even factors into the final boss. Like, there are bosses, there's a final boss, there's a way to complete the game, but it's not really involved in the plot or the gameplay. It's just, I don't know, games should end at some point, I guess, so you have to pick a mission and say, well, that's the last one. They're all broadly the exact same thing. And that's probably the biggest criticism, aside from like speed up complaints and quality of life. The actual game itself is just the same thing like a million times, and there's plenty of room for adding gimmicks and special stages and stuff to change things up a little bit, I think. But that's all there is to say about Mechanicus, probably. At least let's just stop saying things about Mechanicus. Overall, I wouldn't play it again. I did have fun playing it sometimes, but that was partially because of outside like third-party modifications, so we still have to deduct points, I think, for me having to do that. Like, a standard player should never even have to download Cheat Engine to be able to get a game's quality of life up. Combined with the fact that I wouldn't have played this game if I wasn't just planning on complaining about it on the internet, even though I did ultimately have more fun than I expected because I forced myself to play it. I think I'm going to conclude that this is a game where, although I had a lot of fun playing it, I also don't like it. I'm going to put it down as a bad game on the list, even though I played absolutely loads of it, and in many cases really enjoyed playing it. And if you want to know why I'm making a contradictory final remark, see the previous 3 hours of rant. Somewhere in there is the battle between my various opinions on this game. I guess what we'll say is that because the game wasn't good enough, we'll just say it's bad. Like, let's just have high standards here. Like, you only get so many years of life in real life. Why play Mechanicus on normal speed? It should be at double speed. That's it. Like, we don't need to argue any further. It's not worse if you speed it up. It is better. There are only so many hours in the day to play games, so you might as well put more gameplay in those hours. Let's have more gameplay in this game, for example, and all games. Let's raise the bar. It's time to say no to bad quality of life turn-based tactics games, skippable animations, and some other things. I am crashing right now. I'm not going to complain about things again. If only you could skip my videos, your life would be better. You know what? Maybe you can. But unfortunately, if you're hearing these words, the bad news is you failed to skip this video. You accidentally watched all of it, and now you know everything there is to know about Mechanicus as a result. We're going to move on from this and play something else. After this, I played a bunch of games for a short time, actually, carrying on from what I just started saying. So we're going to have a couple of videos where it's like, here's why I started and then stopped playing certain games. Not necessarily for bad reasons either, well, for interesting reasons hopefully, and I'll try and make it interesting, and I hope you don't skip those videos because it's worth sitting through the quote-unquote animation of listening to me deliver my point very slowly, even though you probably know what it's going to be after the first 2 minutes. Let me spend an hour making it anyway, because that's good for me. I enjoy doing it that way. I have some high and mighty reason to be doing it that way, so you should consider it to be directorial intent. It's all intended. Don't use cheat engine to speed up the video like on the YouTube settings where you can put things on 1.5 speed. No, that's not what the dev and developer intended. I've been driven crazy by having to wait a few times while playing Warhammer 40k Mechanicus. Everything that's wrong with this video is somebody else's fault. Thank you for watching.